The doors of the chapel burst open before the priest could finish his first blessing, and every candle in the room seemed to shiver at once. Elena Marchetti stood in the doorway, with her chest heaving and her hands shaking around a folded piece of paper. Her hair had come loose from its pins during the run across the frozen courtyard, and her plain gray coat was soaked through with melting snow. She looked nothing like the 200 guests seated in velvet and silk before her, and she knew it. She did not care. "Stop this wedding," she said, her voice cracking through the silence like a whip. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then the room erupted. Gasps rippled from the front pews to the back. A woman in a wide feathered hat nearly dropped her champagne glass. Somewhere near the altar, Lord Reginald Ashcombe went pale, his jaw tightening as though someone had struck him. 2 guards in dark uniforms moved quickly from the side doors, their boots echoing against the marble floor. One of them reached Elena first, gripping her arm hard enough to make her wince. "Get her out of here," Reginald said sharply, not even looking at her. "She's clearly unwell. Someone call for the physician." The guard began to pull Elena backward. She dug her heels into the floor, refusing to be dragged like a criminal. Her eyes locked on Reginald with a fury that made several guests lean forward in their seats, hungry for whatever scandal was about to unfold. "I am not unwell," Elena said through clenched teeth. "I have proof of what you did to my father." Reginald's composure flickered for the briefest moment, so quickly that only a few people noticed it. But one person did notice. He had been sitting quietly near the back of the chapel, dressed simply for a man of his rank, watching everything, with the sharp, unreadable calm of someone who had spent years learning to hide his thoughts. Alistair Graves, the Duke of Thornleigh, rose slowly from his seat. He was not supposed to be there. In fact, half the guests had whispered about his presence the moment he arrived that morning, since the Duke rarely attended social events, let alone weddings of families several ranks beneath his own. Some said he had come out of respect for an old business partnership with the bride's family. Others said he simply liked to watch how people behaved when they thought no one important was paying attention. Whatever the reason, he was paying attention now. "Leave her alone," he said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried through the chapel with the kind of authority that came from a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. The guard holding Elena's arm froze immediately, his fingers loosening as though the words themselves had physical weight. Every head in the room turned toward the Duke. The organist, who had been quietly playing a soft hymn to fill the tension, stopped mid-note. Even the priest, standing at the altar with his prayer book still open, looked up in surprise. Reginald turned fully now, his handsome face arranged into something between confusion and offense. "Your Grace, I don't think you understand the situation. This woman forced her way into a private ceremony." "I understand perfectly well," Alistair said, walking down the center aisle with unhurried steps. His polished shoes clicked against the stone floor, each step deliberate, each step drawing more eyes toward him. "A woman arrived at your wedding holding what she claims is evidence against you, and your first instinct was to have her physically removed before anyone could hear what she has to say. That tells me a great deal, Lord Ashcombe." A murmur spread through the crowd. Someone near the third row whispered to their companion, and the whisper spread like a small fire catching dry grass. The bride, Lady Priscilla Vane, stood frozen at the altar in her ivory gown, her bouquet of white roses trembling slightly in her gloved hands. She had not said a single word since Elena burst through the doors, but her eyes moved rapidly between her groom and the stranger who had interrupted her wedding, as though she were trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly, violently, revealed itself to be far more complicated than she had ever imagined. "Your Grace," Reginald tried again, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I assure you, whatever this woman is saying, it has no truth to it. She is a stranger. I have never seen her before in my life." "That is a lie," Elena said, her voice steadier now that the guard's grip had loosened. She straightened her coat, lifted her chin, and stepped forward, the folded paper still clutched tightly in her fingers. "You knew my father, Giovanni Marchetti. You knew my father. You knew him very well, in fact, before you destroyed him." The name seemed to land in the room like a stone dropped into still water. A few older guests exchanged glances, as though the name meant something to them, though most of the younger crowd looked simply confused, eager for someone to explain what was happening. Alistair had reached the front of the chapel now. He stood beside Elena, not touching her, not speaking for her, simply standing close enough that anyone with hostile intentions would think twice before trying anything further. His presence alone changed the balance of the room. The guards who had been ready to drag Elena out now stood back, uncertain, waiting for a signal from someone whose authority outranked the grooms. "Let her speak," Alistair said calmly, addressing the room rather than any single person. "If she is wrong, Lord Ashcombe has nothing to fear. If she is right, then this wedding should not continue for another moment." Priscilla's father, a stout man with a graying mustache, who had been sitting proudly in the front row moments earlier, now stood up slowly, his face pale. "Your Grace, with respect, this is a private family matter." It stopped being private the moment 200 guests witnessed a woman being dragged out of a chapel to silence her. Alistair replied, his tone still even, still calm, but firm enough that the father sat back down without another word. Elena felt her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone nearby could hear it. She had rehearsed this moment for weeks, lying awake at night imagining exactly what she would say, how she would say it, and yet now that the moment had actually arrived, every carefully prepared word seemed to scatter from her mind like startled birds. She looked down at the folded paper in her hands, the ink slightly smudged from the sweat of her own palms, and took a breath. 3 years ago, she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "My father owned a small tailoring shop on Wexford Lane. It was not grand, but it was ours, and it had been in our family for 2 generations. He worked with his hands from sunrise to sunset, and he built a good name for himself among the merchants of this city." She paused, glancing at Reginald, whose face had gone rigid, his eyes darting briefly toward the door, as though calculating whether escape was still possible. "Lord Ashcombe came to my father with a proposal," Elena continued. "He said he wanted to invest in the shop, to help it grow into something larger, something that could serve the nobility, instead of just merchants and tradesmen. My father was flattered. He trusted him. He signed papers that Lord Ashcombe told him would protect his ownership, while allowing new investment to come in." "This is absurd," Reginald interrupted, forcing a laugh that came out thin and unconvincing. "I have never invested in a tailoring shop in my life." "You signed the papers under a different name," Elena said, unfolding the letter in her hands and holding it up for the room to see, though she did not hand it over yet. "A name you used only for business you did not want traced back to yourself. The name Reginald Holt." The chapel fell into an even deeper silence than before. Somewhere in the back, a woman whispered the name aloud, as though testing whether it sounded familiar. Alistair's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of recognition crossing his sharp features. He had heard that name before, in a very different context. During a set of business dealings he had been quietly investigating for the better part of a year. He said nothing yet, but his silence had changed, and Elena noticed it. "Within 6 months," Elena continued, "the papers my father signed had transferred nearly all ownership of the shop to this false investor. My father did not understand what had happened until the day men arrived to tell him he no longer owned the building he had worked in for 30 years. He tried to fight it in the courts, but he had no money left for lawyers, because every coin he had was gone, swallowed by debts he did not know he had agreed to." Her voice cracked slightly, and she paused to steady herself before continuing. "He died 8 months later. The physician said it was his heart, but I know it was shame. He believed he had failed our family, when in truth, he had simply trusted the wrong man." The room had gone completely still. Even the guests who moments earlier had been whispering excitedly about scandal, now sat in uncomfortable silence, some looking down at their hands, unable to meet Elena's eyes. Priscilla, still standing at the altar in her wedding gown, had gone as white as the roses in her bouquet. She looked at Reginald, and for the first time since the ceremony began, her expression was not one of nervous excitement, but of dawning, horrified understanding. "This is a fabrication," Reginald said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "A grieving woman looking for someone to blame for her father's death. I am sorry for her loss, truly, but I had nothing to do with it." "Then you will not mind if the letter is examined," Alistair said quietly. "Your Grace, I hardly think—" "I insist," Alistair said, and this time there was something harder beneath the calm surface of his voice, something that made even Reginald take an involuntary step backward. Elena finally held the letter out, not to Reginald, but to Alistair, as though some instinct told her this stranger who had defended her was the only person in the room she could trust with it. He took it carefully, unfolding it with steady hands, and began to read. The room waited. Priscilla had stepped down from the altar now, her bouquet forgotten on the floor beside her, moving slowly toward the small group gathered in the aisle. Her father tried to stop her with a hand on her arm, but she shook him off gently, her eyes fixed on the letter in the Duke's hands. "I would like to see it as well," she said quietly. Alistair looked at her for a moment, then nodded, and handed her the letter without hesitation. Reginald's composure finally cracked entirely. "Priscilla, darling, please, don't let this woman ruin our day with lies." "Be quiet," Priscilla said, and though her voice was soft, it carried a firmness that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. She had spent the last year of her engagement being told what to think, what to feel, how to smile for portraits and guests, and her own family's expectations. In this single moment, reading a letter that threatened to unravel everything she had built her future around, she found a steadiness she did not know she possessed. Her eyes moved across the page, and Elena watched her closely, searching for any sign of doubt, any flicker of disbelief. Instead, she saw something that surprised her: recognition. Priscilla's hands trembled, not from confusion, but from the terrible sense of pieces falling into place. "The signature," Priscilla whispered. "I have seen this signature before." "Where?" Alistair asked. "On documents in Reginald's study," she said slowly, her voice growing quieter, as though she were speaking more to herself than to the room. "I found them once, months ago, when I was looking for something else. Papers with a name I did not recognize, Reginald Holt. I asked him about it, and he told me it was an old business partner who had passed away. I believed him." The crowd erupted into hushed, urgent conversation. Reginald looked as though the floor beneath him had begun to crumble, his eyes darting from Priscilla to Alistair to Elena, searching for any ally in a room that had turned entirely against him in the span of a few minutes. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, his voice rising now, edged with something close to panic. "I can explain everything, Priscilla, if you would just let me." "You had a chance to explain it to me months ago," Priscilla said, folding the letter carefully, and holding it against her chest as though protecting it from him. "You chose to lie instead." Elena felt something unexpected rise in her chest, something she had not anticipated feeling in this moment she had planned for so long. It was not triumph, not exactly. It was closer to relief, the kind that comes after carrying an enormous weight for a very long time, and finally being allowed to set it down, even if only for a moment. She looked at Alistair, this stranger who had stepped forward to defend her, without knowing anything about her, without any obligation to do so, and found herself wondering, briefly, who he truly was, and why a man of his rank had chosen to involve himself in a fight that was not his own. "Guards," Reginald said suddenly, his voice sharp with desperation, turning toward the men who had originally tried to remove Elena. "Escort this woman from the property immediately, and see to it that she does not." "The guards answer to the household hosting this wedding," Alistair interrupted, his voice cutting through the chapel like a blade. "And I believe, given what has just been revealed, that the household in question no longer wishes to associate itself with you." He turned to Priscilla's father, who sat frozen in the front pew, his face a mixture of horror and humiliation. "Am I mistaken, sir?" The older man rose slowly, his eyes moving from his daughter, to the letter in her hands, to Reginald, whose carefully constructed image had shattered entirely in the space of a single wedding ceremony. "You are not mistaken, Your Grace," he said heavily. "This wedding is finished." Gasps rippled through the chapel once more, followed by a wave of urgent whispers, as guests began rising from their seats, uncertain whether to leave or stay, and watch the scandal unfold further. Somewhere near the back, a woman fainted dramatically into her husband's arms, though whether from genuine shock or simple theatrical instinct, no one could say for certain. Elena stood in the center of it all, her breathing finally slowing, the paper that had once felt so heavy in her hands, now resting safely with Priscilla instead. She had come here with a single purpose, to expose the truth about her father's ruin, and in the space of a few extraordinary minutes, that purpose had been fulfilled beyond anything she had imagined. But as the chapel dissolved into chaos around her, Elena found herself glancing once more at the Duke of Thornleigh, standing calmly beside her, as though none of this disorder touched him at all, and she felt a question form in her mind that she could not yet answer. Why had he defended her? And why did some quiet, distant part of her feel as though she had seen those steady gray eyes somewhere before, long before this day, in a place far from chapels and dukes and ruined weddings? She did not have time to wonder for long, because at that exact moment, Reginald, cornered and desperate, did something no one in the room expected. He lunged forward, not toward Elena, but toward the letter still clutched in Priscilla's hands, as though destroying the evidence could somehow undo everything that had already been said aloud in front of 200 witnesses. Alistair moved before anyone else could react, stepping directly into Reginald's path, his expression hardening into something far less patient than the calm command he had used before. "I would not do that," he said quietly. "If I were you." The chapel held its breath, and Elena realized, with a strange mixture of fear and fascination, that whatever had just begun in this room was far from over. Reginald froze mid-step, his hand still stretched toward the letter, his breath coming fast and shallow. The Duke had not raised his voice, had not moved with any obvious threat, and yet something in the way he stood, calm and immovable as stone, made Reginald's outstretched arm fall slowly back to his side. "You have humiliated me in front of everyone I know," Reginald said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fury and something closer to fear. "Over a piece of paper, from a woman no one here has ever met. You humiliated yourself the moment you tried to silence her instead of answering her," Alistair replied. "A guilty man defends himself with words. Only a desperate one reaches for silence." The guests who had begun rising from their seats now paused in the aisles, phones and fans forgotten in their hands, watching the unfolding scene with the kind of hushed fascination usually reserved for theater. Priscilla's mother had appeared from somewhere near the front, pressing a handkerchief to her mouth, though whether from tears or barely contained scandal, it was difficult to tell. Elena stood slightly apart from the confrontation now, her arms wrapped around herself as the adrenaline that had carried her through the chapel doors began to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. She watched Alistair with a strange, growing sense of familiarity that she could not quite place, a feeling that tugged at the edges of memory like a name on the tip of her tongue. It was not until Reginald finally turned and stormed from the chapel, trailed by 2 guards who seemed uncertain whether they were escorting him out or simply following in stunned silence, that Elena allowed herself to breathe fully for the first time since she had arrived. The chapel doors slammed shut behind him, and the sound echoed through the stone hall like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Priscilla sank onto the front pew, the letter still clutched in her hands, her wedding gown pooling around her like spilled cream. Her father knelt beside her, murmuring something too quiet for anyone else to hear, while her mother hovered nearby, dabbing uselessly at tears that had not yet fallen. Alistair turned to Elena. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice gentler now than it had been with Reginald, though still carrying that same quiet authority. "No," Elena said, though her arm still ached faintly where the guard had gripped it. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." "You would have found another way," Alistair said simply. "People who carry the truth as carefully as you carried that letter rarely let it go unheard." Something about the way he said it, the certainty in his tone, made Elena look at him more closely. He was tall, with dark hair beginning to gray slightly at the temples, despite a face that did not look old enough to justify it, and eyes the color of storm clouds, gray and steady. There was a stillness to him, the kind that came either from great confidence or great restraint, and Elena found herself unable to decide which. "Have we met before?" she asked before she could stop herself. Alistair's expression flickered, just barely, something like surprise crossing his features before he composed himself again. "What makes you ask that?" "I don't know," Elena admitted. "Something about your voice. It felt familiar the moment you spoke." Before he could answer, they were interrupted by Priscilla, who had risen from the pew and approached them slowly, the letter still held tightly in one hand. Up close, Elena could see that the bride's eyes were red-rimmed but dry, as though she had decided, somewhere in the last several minutes, that she would not give Reginald the satisfaction of her tears in front of 200 witnesses. "I owe you an apology," Priscilla said, addressing Elena directly. "For the way you were treated when you first arrived. No one should have laid a hand on you." "You don't owe me anything," Elena said. You didn't know. I should have asked more questions a long time ago, Priscilla said, her voice quiet but firm. There were signs. I ignored them because it was easier than facing what they meant. Elena did not know what to say to that, so she simply nodded, and for a moment, the two women stood in a strange, unspoken understanding. Two people who had never met before today, bound together by a single man's deception. What will you do now? Elena asked. Priscilla looked down at the letter in her hands, then out at the chapel full of guests, who were still whispering amongst themselves, clearly torn between leaving out of respect for the ruined ceremony and staying out of pure curiosity.
I will make sure everyone in this room understands exactly why this wedding did not happen, she said.
And then, I will make sure the proper authorities see this letter. If Reginald did this to your father, there is no reason to believe you are his only victim. The word victim settled uncomfortably over Elena, a term she had spent the last 3 years refusing to apply to her father, though she knew, deep down, it was accurate. Giovanni Marchetti had not simply failed. He had been deliberately, carefully ruined by a man who had smiled at him across a negotiating table while planning his downfall. There is something else you should know, Alistair said, drawing both women's attention. I have been investigating Reginald Ashcombe for several months, though not in connection with your father, Miss Marchetti. A business associate of mine lost a significant sum in an investment scheme that traced back to a name very similar to the one on your letter. I had not yet confirmed the connection until today. Elena stared at him. You already suspected him. I suspected the name Reginald Holt belonged to someone using it as an alias, Alistair said. I did not know it belonged to the same man about to marry into one of the most respected families in the region. Your arrival today confirmed what I could not prove on my own. So you didn't come here to defend me specifically, Elena said, feeling something oddly like disappointment settle in her chest, though she could not explain why. You came because it served your own investigation. I came to this wedding as an obligation to an old family friendship, Alistair said. I stayed silent through most of the ceremony because that is generally the polite thing to do at a wedding, regardless of one's personal suspicions. But when I saw a guard laying hands on an unarmed woman, simply for speaking an uncomfortable truth, my reason for intervening had nothing to do with investigations, business associates, or old friendships. It had everything to do with the fact that it was wrong, and I was in a position to stop it. Elena studied his face for a long moment, searching for insincerity and finding none. Whatever else the Duke of Thornleigh was, he did not seem to be a man who spoke carelessly. Priscilla, watching the exchange with quiet interest, cleared her throat gently. Perhaps this conversation would be better continued somewhere more private than the middle of a chapel full of gossiping guests, she said, glancing pointedly at the crowd still lingering in the pews, clearly reluctant to miss a single further development. She was right, of course. Elena became suddenly aware of just how many eyes were on them, how many whispered conversations were undoubtedly already forming the shape of the story that would spread through the city within hours. By tomorrow morning, every household of consequence would know that Reginald Ashcombe's wedding had collapsed in scandal, and Elena's name, along with her father's, would be attached to it. The thought made her stomach twist, with something between vindication and dread. She had wanted the truth exposed. She had not fully considered what it would mean to become part of the story herself, a stranger thrust suddenly into the center of high society's attention. There is a private room through the side hall, Priscilla said, already turning to lead the way, her ruined wedding gown trailing behind her, like the last remnant of a day that would never happen the way it had been planned. We can speak there without an audience. Elena hesitated only a moment before following, and Alistair fell into step beside her, close enough that she could feel the quiet solidity of his presence, even without speaking. As they walked, guests parted to let them pass, some whispering behind raised hands, others simply staring openly, unable to hide their curiosity. The side room, when they reached it, turned out to be a small parlor, decorated for the reception that would now never take place. Silver trays of untouched pastries sat on a long table beneath a window, and champagne glasses had already been arranged in careful rows, waiting for a celebration that had crumbled before it could begin. Priscilla closed the door behind them, shutting out the hum of the chapel, and finally allowed her shoulders to sag with visible exhaustion. I need you to tell me everything, she said, turning to Elena. Every detail you know about what Reginald did to your father. I intend to take this to the magistrate myself, and I want to be certain the case cannot be dismissed or twisted into something smaller than it truly is." Elena nodded, grateful for the chance to finally lay out the story in full, uninterrupted by chaos or shouting. She began slowly, describing her father's shop on Wexford Lane, the careful pride he took in his work, the way customers would travel from other districts simply because they trusted his craftsmanship above all others. He met Reginald, or Reginald Holt, as we knew him then, at a merchants' gathering. Elena continued. He seemed charming, generous even. He spoke about wanting to support local craftsmen who deserved wider recognition. My father was flattered. He had built something with his own hands over 30 years, and here was a wealthy man offering to help it grow. She paused, her fingers twisting together in her lap. Alistair, seated across from her, remained quiet, listening, with an intensity that made her feel, oddly, as though her words mattered more than she had allowed herself to believe in the years since her father's death. "The papers he asked my father to sign were complicated," Elena went on, full of legal terms my father did not fully understand, though he trusted the lawyer who reviewed them, not realizing the lawyer had also been paid by Reginald. "By the time we understood what had happened, the shop no longer belonged to us. Reginald owned the majority share, and within months, he sold the building entirely to another buyer, leaving my father with nothing but debts he had never agreed to." "Do you have copies of these original papers?" Priscilla asked, her voice sharpening with the focus of someone building a case, rather than simply listening to a tragedy. "Some," Elena said. "My father kept everything he could, even after the shop was gone. He believed, until the day he died, that if he could just find the right person to listen, he could prove what had been done to him. But no one with any influence would agree to see him. He was just a tailor. Reginald was already becoming a name people whispered about with respect, not suspicion." "That will not happen again," Alistair said quietly. "Not while I have any say in the matter." Elena looked at him, startled by the certainty in his voice. "Why does this matter so much to you?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes distant, as though weighing how much to reveal. "Because I have seen what happens when men with money and charm are allowed to ruin ordinary people without consequence, simply because no one with power was willing to look closely enough. I have resources, Miss Marchetti, and influence I rarely use for anything beyond my own business interests. It is past time I use them for something that actually matters." Priscilla, watching this exchange with quiet curiosity, exchanged a brief glance with Elena that suggested she, too, sensed something deeper stirring beneath the Duke's carefully measured words, something that went beyond simple justice or old business grievances. Before anyone could say more, a sharp knock sounded at the door, and one of the household staff entered, looking flustered and slightly out of breath. "Your Grace, my lady," the young man said, addressing Priscilla and Alistair both. "There is a man outside, claiming to represent Lord Ashcomb's legal counsel. He is demanding to speak with someone immediately, and he says he has come to collect the letter before it can be, in his words, misused." Elena's stomach dropped. Priscilla's hand tightened instinctively around the folded paper still resting against her chest. Alistair rose from his seat, his expression hardening into the same calm, immovable resolve Elena had seen in the chapel only an hour before. "Tell him the letter is now evidence in an ongoing matter, and that he will need to address any concerns to the magistrate directly," he said, "and send word to my own solicitor. I want copies made of everything Miss Marchetti can provide before this evening ends." The staff member nodded quickly and hurried from the room, and Elena felt a fresh wave of unease settle over her. She had come to the wedding prepared to speak the truth, but she had not fully considered that Reginald, cornered and humiliated, might not simply disappear quietly into disgrace. Men like him rarely gave up their power without a fight, and something told her, watching the tension return to Alistair's shoulders, that the day's confrontation was only the beginning of a much longer battle. While they waited for the solicitor's arrival, Priscilla excused herself briefly to change out of her wedding gown, returning a short while later, in a simple gray dress that seemed, to Elena's eyes, to suit her far better than the elaborate ivory silk she had worn only an hour earlier. There was something almost liberating in the transformation, as though shedding the gown allowed Priscilla to shed some of the careful performance that came with being a bride, replacing it instead with the plain, determined woman who had chosen truth over comfort in front of 200 witnesses. "I keep waiting to feel devastated," Priscilla admitted quietly, settling back into her chair beside the unlit fireplace. Everyone always says a broken engagement should feel like the end of the world. Instead, I feel almost relieved, as though I have narrowly escaped a fate I did not fully understand I was walking toward. Perhaps that relief is its own kind of answer, Elena offered gently. Grief usually announces itself rather loudly. If it has not arrived by now, perhaps it never truly intended to. Priscilla considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. You speak with unusual wisdom for someone who arrived here today as a complete stranger. I have had a great deal of practice comforting myself these past 3 years, Elena said, a faint, rueful smile touching her lips. Grief becomes a familiar companion eventually, whether you invite it or not. Their quiet conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Alistair's solicitor, a precise, careful man who introduced himself briefly before settling into methodical work, copying every document Elena carried with painstaking attention to detail. Elena watched the process with a strange, hollow feeling in her chest, aware that the fragile evidence she had carried so carefully for weeks was finally, formally being transformed into something with real legal weight, something that could no longer be dismissed as simply the ramblings of a grieving daughter. By the time the copying was finished, and the solicitor had departed with careful instructions to secure everything safely, night had fully fallen over the manor grounds, and Elena found herself unexpectedly, thoroughly exhausted, the adrenaline that had carried her through the chapel doors, finally draining away and leaving nothing behind but bone-deep weariness. The man from Reginald's legal counsel did not leave quietly. Elena could hear his raised voice through the parlor door, sharp and demanding, arguing with the household staff in the corridor outside. Priscilla's father joined the exchange moments later, his own voice booming with an authority that suggested he was not accustomed to being questioned inside his own home. The commotion lasted nearly 10 minutes before it finally faded, replaced by the heavy silence of a house still reeling from the collapse of its long-planned celebration. He's gone, the young staff member reported when he returned, slightly breathless. For now, but he said Lord Ashcombe's solicitor will be filing something with the magistrate first thing tomorrow morning, claiming the letter was obtained through fraud and coercion. Let him file whatever he likes, Alistair said, unbothered. A claim without evidence is simply noise. We, on the other hand, will have documentation, testimony, and a paper trail that leads directly back to the false identity Reginald has been using for years. Elena admired his confidence, though a small, anxious part of her wondered how many times a man like Reginald had faced accusations before and managed, through money or connections or simple charm, to slip free of consequences that would have crushed anyone with less influence. She thought of her father, of the years he had spent trying and failing to find someone who would listen, and she felt a familiar tightness settle in her chest. He will not disappear easily, she said quietly. My father learned that the hard way. Your father did not have a duke and a former bride from one of the wealthiest families in the region standing beside him, Priscilla said, her voice steady, despite the exhaustion visible in her posture. I intend to make certain this does not simply fade away, because it becomes inconvenient for people with reputations to protect. Elena looked at her with genuine gratitude, surprised at how quickly the woman whose wedding had just been destroyed had transformed her own heartbreak into fierce resolve. There was a strength in Priscilla that Elena had not expected from someone raised in a world of careful manners and quiet obedience, and she found herself grateful that fate, however cruelly, had placed the letter in front of a woman capable of using it well. As the household staff began clearing away the untouched pastries and champagne glasses that had been prepared for a reception that would now never happen, Alistair suggested they move the conversation to somewhere quieter still, away from the lingering guests who had not yet fully dispersed from the chapel grounds. They ended up in a small library at the far end of the manor, its shelves lined with leather-bound books that looked as though they had not been read in years, though someone clearly dusted them with great care. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light across the room, and finally chasing away some of the chill that had settled into Elena's bones since her frantic run across the courtyard earlier that afternoon. It was there, settled into a worn armchair with a cup of tea she barely remembered being handed, that Elena found herself studying Alistair's face again, still troubled by that persistent, nagging sense of familiarity. You asked earlier if we had met before, Alistair said, as though reading her thoughts. I have been turning the same question over in my mind since you asked it. And? Elena asked. Do you recall a carriage accident on the coastal road near Belhaven, roughly 2 years ago? He asked. A broken wheel, a traveler asking a young woman at a roadside inn for directions, and a place to wait out the rain? Elena's cup nearly slipped from her fingers. The memory surfaced suddenly, vivid and unexpected. A rainy afternoon at her aunt's small inn, where she had been staying to help during a difficult season. A stranger arriving soaked and irritated after his carriage wheel had cracked on the rough coastal road. He had been dressed plainly, without any of the fine tailoring that marked most wealthy travelers, and she had assumed him to be a merchant of modest means, nothing more. "That was you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was traveling without my usual escort," Alistair admitted, a faint, almost rueful smile touching his lips for the first time since Elena had met him. "I did that occasionally in those years, when the weight of my title became too heavy to carry comfortably. It was easier to move through the world unnoticed, to speak with people who had no idea who I was, and therefore no reason to flatter me or fear me." Elena remembered him now with startling clarity. He had been short-tempered from the rain and the broken wheel, and she, exhausted from a long day of helping her aunt manage the inn, had not bothered to soften her words the way she might have for a guest she recognized as important. "I told you the tea was terrible, because you kept complaining about everything else," she said slowly, memory sharpening with every passing second. "You looked so offended." "I had never been spoken to so plainly by anyone outside my own family," Alistair said, and this time, his smile reached his eyes. It was, oddly enough, one of the more memorable conversations of that entire year. "I had no idea you were a duke," Elena said. "I would have been mortified." "That is precisely why I never told you," he replied. "I did not want the conversation to change the moment you learned my title. People speak to dukes very differently than they speak to strangers with broken carriage wheels." Priscilla, who had been listening quietly from a nearby chair, raised an eyebrow with clear interest, though she said nothing, allowing the two of them to continue without interruption. "You stayed only one night," Elena said, piecing together fragments of memory that had gone unexamined for 2 years. "You left before dawn, before I even woke." "I had business waiting for me that could not be delayed," Alistair said. "I regretted leaving, without a proper farewell, though I told myself at the time it was for the best. A duke traveling incognito has little business forming attachments to innkeepers' nieces, however sharp their tongue, or however memorable their tea." There was something in the way he said it, something quieter and more honest than the calm authority he had shown in the chapel, that made Elena's chest tighten with an emotion she did not fully want to examine in front of Priscilla, or in the middle of a day already overflowing with revelations. "And yet here we are," she said instead, keeping her voice light, 2 years later, "and you're defending me from an angry groom in the middle of his own wedding." "Fate has an odd sense of timing," Alistair agreed. Their quiet moment was interrupted by another knock at the door, this one softer than the last, and Priscilla's father entered, looking considerably more composed than he had in the chapel, though his eyes carried the weary strain of a man who had aged several years within a single afternoon. "Word is already spreading through the district," he said grimly. "I have received 3 messages already from families asking what happened, and I imagine there will be dozens more by morning. I fear there is no containing this now." "Then we should not try to contain it," Priscilla said firmly. "We should make certain the true story spreads faster than any rumor Reginald tries to invent to protect himself." Her father looked at her with something like surprised admiration, as though seeing a version of his daughter he had not fully recognized before. "You sound remarkably steady for a woman who was meant to be married an hour ago." "I am furious," Priscilla admitted, "but I would rather use that fury to make certain justice is done than waste it on tears Reginald does not deserve to witness." Elena found herself quietly admiring both of them, this family that could have easily chosen to protect their own reputation by quietly dismissing her claims and sweeping the entire scandal beneath expensive rugs, yet had instead chosen to stand firmly on the side of truth, even when it meant public humiliation for themselves. "There is something else you should know," Alistair said, turning to address the room. "Reginald did not act alone in this. Schemes of this size rarely succeed without help, whether from corrupt lawyers, complicit bankers, or business partners willing to look away in exchange for their own share of the profits. If we are to bring real consequences against him, we need to understand the full network that allowed this fraud to succeed for as long as it did. You think there are others involved? Priscilla's father asked. I am certain of it, Alistair said. The business associate I mentioned earlier, the one who lost a significant sum in an investment scheme, described dealings that involved at least 2 other names I have not yet been able to trace. If Reginald has been operating this way for years, Miss Marchetti's father is unlikely to be his only victim, and this wedding was unlikely to be the only fortune he intended to secure through deception. The weight of that statement settled heavily over the room. Elena thought of her father again, of the years he had spent alone in his grief, believing himself simply unlucky or foolish, never understanding that he had been the target of a carefully constructed scheme, designed by a man who had likely ruined others in exactly the same way, long before and possibly long after. I want to help find them, Elena said suddenly, the others. If there are more people out there who lost everything because of him, they deserve to know the truth just as much as I did. Alistair studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering across his features. It will not be easy, he said. Men like Reginald are skilled at hiding their tracks, and some of his associates may be far more dangerous than he is, especially if they believe exposure threatens their own freedom, rather than simply their reputation. I have already lost my father, my family's shop, and 3 years of my life to grief and anger, Elena said. I am not afraid of difficulty. Then we will begin tomorrow, Alistair said. Tonight, I think everyone in this room has earned some rest, however unlikely that seems, given the circumstances. As the others began discussing practical matters, where Elena would stay for the evening since traveling back to her modest lodgings so late seemed unwise, and how best to handle the flood of curious messages already arriving at the manor, Elena found her mind drifting back to that rainy afternoon 2 years ago, to a stranger complaining about weak tea in her aunt's small inn, utterly unaware that fate was quietly stitching their lives together, long before either of them understood what was happening. She did not yet know how deep the danger surrounding Reginald's hidden network truly ran, or how many people beyond her own family had already suffered because of his careful deceptions. But sitting in the warm firelight of that unfamiliar library, surrounded by unlikely allies who had chosen truth over comfort, Elena felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in years. She felt hope, sharp and unfamiliar, blooming quietly in the space where grief had lived for so long. Later that night, unable to settle her thoughts enough for sleep, Elena wandered down to the manor's kitchen, drawn by habit rather than hunger, needing the familiar comfort of doing something ordinary with her hands, after a day that had upended everything she thought she understood about her own life. She found the kitchen dark and quiet, the household staff long since retired for the evening, and busied herself simply boiling water for tea, a small ritual that reminded her of countless nights spent in her aunt's inn, waiting out storms with nothing but a kettle, and her own thoughts for company. She did not expect to find Alistair there as well, seated at the long wooden table usually reserved for the kitchen staff, a single candle burning low beside a stack of papers he had clearly brought with him from the library. Could not sleep either? He asked, glancing up as she entered. Too much to think about, Elena admitted, gesturing toward the kettle. Would you like some? Though I should warn you, my tea has not improved in 2 years. A genuine laugh escaped him, low and unguarded, a sound she suspected few people beyond his closest family had ever heard. I would welcome it regardless, he said. Consistency has its own particular charm. She prepared 2 cups and joined him at the table, the quiet domesticity of the moment, feeling strangely at odds with everything that had happened since the wedding, the confrontations, the accusations, the danger that had already begun circling them both. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke, simply sitting together in companionable silence as the candle flickered and the kettle's warmth slowly faded from the room. I keep thinking about my father, Elena said eventually, wrapping her hands around her cup, wondering what he would say if he could see everything that has happened these past few days. Whether he would be proud, or whether he would simply worry that I have put myself in danger chasing something that cannot bring him back. I imagine he would feel both things at once, Alistair said thoughtfully. Pride and worry are rarely mutually exclusive, particularly for a parent watching a child do something brave and difficult. Elena considered this, finding comfort in the simple honesty of his answer, rather than empty reassurance. "You speak as though you understand that particular tension well," she said. "Do you have children of your own?" "No," Alistair said, a faint shadow crossing his expression. "Though I understand it through my own parents, particularly my father, who spent the final years of his life deeply proud of the improvements I made to our family's holdings, while simultaneously worrying, quite loudly, that I worked myself into the ground doing it. I did not always appreciate the worry at the time. I understand it rather better now." "Is he still living?" Elena asked gently. "He passed nearly 4 years ago," Alistair said. "My mother followed less than a year later. I inherited the title far younger than I ever expected to, and far less prepared for it than I would have liked." Elena felt a quiet kinship settle between them at the admission. Two people who understood, in their own very different ways, the particular weight of grief arriving before one felt ready to carry it. "I am sorry," she said softly. "Grief has a way of arriving regardless of readiness, doesn't it?"
"It does," Alistair agreed.
"Though I have found, these past several years, that the weight becomes more bearable when shared with the right company, rather than carried entirely alone." Their eyes met across the small candlelit table, and something unspoken passed between them, an understanding neither fully ready to name, though both felt its quiet presence all the same. Elena looked away first, finishing her tea in a comfortable silence that carried none of the awkwardness such a moment might have held only days earlier, before circumstance had bound them together so thoroughly. "We should rest," she said eventually, though she made no immediate move to leave. "Tomorrow will likely bring its own difficulties, and we will need clear minds to face them." "Undoubtedly," Alistair agreed, though he too remained seated a moment longer than necessary, neither of them quite ready to end the quiet peace of the evening. Eventually they parted ways in the corridor outside their respective rooms, a simple good night exchanged between them that carried far more warmth than the words themselves suggested. Elena lay awake for some time afterward, staring at the ceiling of her borrowed room, turning over the events of the day, the shock of recognizing Alistair from that rainy afternoon 2 years past, the growing danger surrounding Reginald's hidden network, and beneath it all, a quiet, persistent warmth she had not expected to feel again after so many years spent buried beneath grief. She fell asleep eventually, her dreams filled not with chapels or letters or fraud, but with rain-soaked roads and roadside inns, and a stranger's voice complaining, quite unreasonably, about weak tea. Elena woke before dawn to the sound of someone moving through the guest room she had been given for the night, and for one disoriented moment she thought she was still dreaming of the chapel, of shouting voices and folded letters, and gray eyes watching her with quiet intensity. Then she heard the click of the window latch, and every muscle in her body went rigid. She lay perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs, listening as careful footsteps crossed the wooden floor toward the small writing desk, where she had left her satchel the night before, the satchel containing the original documents her father had kept, the same papers Alistair's solicitor had not yet finished copying. She had two choices. She could stay silent and hope the intruder left without noticing she was awake, or she could act. Her father had raised her with more caution than courage, but 3 years of grief and injustice had reshaped something inside her, and before she had fully decided what to do, her body moved on its own. She sat up sharply and shouted for help at the top of her lungs. The figure at the desk spun around, startled, and for a brief, terrifying second, their eyes met across the dark room. A man Elena did not recognize, his face partially obscured by a dark scarf pulled up over his nose. He hesitated only a moment before grabbing the satchel and lunging for the window he had clearly used to enter. Elena scrambled out of bed, grabbing the nearest heavy object, a brass candlestick from the bedside table, and threw it with more force than precision. It missed the intruder, but struck the window frame hard enough to make him flinch, buying her precious seconds as the door to her room burst open behind her. Alistair appeared in the doorway, still dressed from the night before, as though he had not yet gone to bed at all, his expression sharpening instantly at the sight of the open window, and the fleeing figure disappearing over the ledge, into the darkness of the courtyard below. "Stay here," he ordered, already moving past her toward the window, but Elena was done being told to stay anywhere while danger unfolded around her. "He has my father's papers," she said, following him despite his instruction, her bare feet cold against the floor. The original documents. If he gets away with them. He will not get far, Alistair said grimly, leaning out the window and scanning the shadowed courtyard below. Shouts had already begun echoing through the manor grounds, as staff members, woken by Elena's scream, converged on the scene, with lanterns held high. By the time Elena and Alistair reached the ground floor, breathless from the rushed descent down the manor's winding staircase, the courtyard was full of confused voices and swinging lantern light, but no sign of the intruder remained, beyond a single dropped glove near the garden wall, and a set of footprints leading toward the outer road. "He's gone," one of the household guards reported, jogging back toward them with visible frustration. There was a horse waiting just beyond the wall. He must have planned his escape route before he ever entered the property. Elena felt her stomach drop as the full weight of what had just happened settled over her. Someone had known exactly where she was sleeping, exactly which room held her father's papers, and exactly how to escape without being caught. This was not a random opportunist looking to steal valuables from a wealthy household. This was someone connected to Reginald, someone determined to erase the evidence before it could be used against him. "They knew," she said aloud, her voice shaking slightly, despite her efforts to steady it. They knew exactly what to look for. Alistair's expression had gone hard and unreadable, the calm authority of the previous day, replaced by something colder, more focused. "Reginald's solicitor left the manor last night, after being turned away," he said slowly, thinking aloud. "It would not have taken much for him to report back exactly which room you had been given, especially if any of the household staff spoke carelessly to the wrong person." "You think someone here betrayed us?" Elena asked, alarmed. "I think fear and money can loosen the loyalty of even well-meaning people," Alistair said. "I do not yet know who spoke, but I intend to find out." Priscilla appeared moments later, still in her nightclothes, with a shawl thrown hastily over her shoulders, her face pale with alarm as she took in the scene of scattered lanterns and anxious staff. "What happened?" I heard shouting. "Someone broke into Elena's room and stole the original documents," Alistair explained briefly. "Fortunately, my solicitor finished copying most of the material last night, before returning to his own lodgings, but the originals are now gone, along with whatever fingerprints or handwriting samples might have proven useful for further examination." "This is exactly what I feared," Priscilla said, her voice tight with anger. "Reginald is not simply going to accept disgrace quietly. He intends to fight this with every resource available to him." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how thin her nightdress was against the cold morning air, and how exposed she felt standing in the middle of a courtyard discussing a crime that had targeted her specifically, in a home she had believed to be safe only hours earlier. "I should not have brought this danger into your household," she said quietly to Priscilla. "You have already lost enough because of my letter. I never intended for anyone else to be put at risk." "You did nothing wrong," Priscilla said firmly, gripping Elena's arm with surprising strength, for someone who had spent the previous day discovering her fiancé's true nature. "The danger belongs entirely to Reginald, and whoever helps him. You are simply the person brave enough to expose it." Despite the reassurance, Elena could not shake the cold unease settling deep in her stomach. If Reginald was willing to send someone to steal evidence in the middle of the night, what else might he be willing to do to protect himself from the consequences he so clearly deserved? They moved the discussion indoors as the sun began rising over the manor grounds, gathering once more in the small library that had become, in less than a full day, something like a war room for the unlikely alliance formed between a duke, a jilted bride, and a grieving seamstress, determined to see justice done. "I want to send word to my solicitor immediately," Alistair said, already moving toward the writing desk in the corner of the room. "He needs to secure the copies he made last night somewhere far more protected than his own office, somewhere Reginald's associates cannot easily reach. I also want additional guards posted at every entrance to this property until this matter is resolved." "And Elena?" Priscilla asked. "She cannot stay here indefinitely, but she also cannot simply return to her own lodgings if someone is willing to break into a duke's household to silence her." Elena felt a flush of embarrassment at being discussed, as though she were a problem to be solved, though she understood the practical necessity of the conversation. "I have stayed in far less comfortable places than this manor," she said, attempting a small, weary smile. "I do not need special protection. I simply need to see this through to the end. Bravery is admirable, Miss Marchetti, Alistair said, turning to face her directly, his gray eyes serious. But it is not the same as safety, and I have no intention of allowing anyone connected to this case to come to harm, simply because caution felt unnecessary in the moment. Elena opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again, recognizing the truth in his words even as pride urged her to resist it. She thought of her father again, of how his stubborn insistence on handling matters alone had left him isolated and vulnerable when Reginald's scheme finally collapsed around him. She did not want to repeat his mistakes now, not when so much more than her own pride was at stake. "What do you suggest?" she asked instead. "You will remain here, under proper protection, until we have secured enough evidence to bring formal charges that cannot easily be dismissed or buried," Alistair said. "I will also begin reaching out, carefully and quietly, to other families who may have suffered similar losses at Reginald's hands. If there is a pattern to his schemes, we need to expose it fully before he has the chance to disappear entirely and begin again somewhere new." "You think he might flee?" Priscilla asked. "Men like Reginald rarely stay to face consequences they can avoid," Alistair said grimly. "If he believes exposure is inevitable, his priority will shift from protecting his reputation to protecting his freedom, and that makes him considerably more dangerous, not less." The library fell into a heavy, thoughtful silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire that had been relit against the early morning chill. Elena stared into the flames, thinking of the stolen satchel, the masked intruder's cold, calculating efficiency, and the unsettling realization that whatever quiet, ordinary life she had built for herself as a seamstress in the years since her father's death had ended the moment she walked through the chapel doors. There was no going back now. Not to the small rented room where she mended gowns for wealthy strangers who never bothered to learn her name. Not to the quiet, grinding grief that had defined her days for the last 3 years. She had chosen this path deliberately, knowing it would be difficult, but she had not fully understood, until this cold morning in an unfamiliar courtyard, exactly how far Reginald might go to protect the empire of lies he had built. "I am not afraid of him," she said finally, breaking the silence, though her voice carried a slight tremor that betrayed at least some uncertainty beneath her resolve. "You should be a little afraid," Alistair said, not unkindly. "Fear, in reasonable measure, keeps people careful. What matters is that it does not stop you from moving forward." Elena met his gaze, finding in it not judgment but something closer to genuine concern, the same quiet steadiness she remembered from a rainy afternoon 2 years earlier, when a stranger with a broken carriage wheel had complained about weak tea, without ever revealing his true rank, or the storm of consequence that would eventually follow them both into this very room. "Then let us move forward carefully," she said. "But let us move forward." Alistair nodded. Something like respect and something else. Something warmer and harder to name. Passing briefly across his expression, before he turned back to the desk to begin drafting the letters that would set the next stage of their fight into motion. Later that afternoon, Alistair called together every member of the household staff, from the senior housekeeper to the youngest stable boy, gathering them in the main hall to address the break-in directly, rather than allowing suspicion and rumor to fester unspoken among people who had served the family faithfully for years. Elena watched from the edge of the room as he spoke to them calmly, without accusation, explaining simply that someone connected to the previous day's events had gained information about the household's layout, and asking whether anyone had noticed anything unusual in the days leading up to the intrusion. A young kitchen maid named Susanna eventually stepped forward, her hands twisting nervously in her apron, admitting that a well-dressed stranger had approached her 3 days earlier, near the market square, asking friendly, seemingly harmless questions about the manor's routines, which rooms faced the courtyard, when the household typically settled for the night. She had thought nothing of it at the time, assuming him simply a curious traveler admiring the estate from a distance, and had answered his questions without any sense that she was doing something wrong. "You are not to blame," Alistair told her gently, seeing the anguish plain on her young face. "You could not have known his intentions. I only need you to describe him as precisely as you can, so that we might identify him if he attempts anything further." Susanna's description, though imprecise in many details, matched closely enough with the fleeing figure from the previous night that Alistair felt confident the two encounters were connected. further evidence that Reginald's network extended well beyond his own immediate household, employing people willing to gather information through friendly deception long before any actual intrusion took place. "This tells us something important," Alistair said to Elena, once the staff had been dismissed. The hall empty once more, but for the two of them, and the lingering smell of extinguished lanterns. Reginald did not simply react in panic after the wedding collapsed. He had already begun preparing contingencies, gathering information about potential threats well before any single letter was ever read aloud in that chapel. "You think he suspected something might go wrong before I even arrived?" Elena asked, unsettled by the implication. "I think a man who builds an empire on careful deception learns, eventually, to prepare for every possible unraveling," Alistair said grimly. "Which means we should assume he has resources and contingencies we have not yet discovered, and plan accordingly, rather than allowing ourselves to be surprised again." The rest of the day passed in careful, methodical preparation. Alistair, drafting letters to be sent quietly to trusted contacts across several districts, inquiries designed to surface any additional victims of Reginald's schemes without alerting him to the scope of the investigation building against him. Elena spent the hours assisting where she could, her practical knowledge of the merchant and tradesman communities proving valuable in identifying which families might be approached safely, and which connections carried too much risk of information reaching Reginald's allies before they were ready to act. By evening, exhaustion had settled deep into Elena's bones, the accumulated weight of danger and vigilance pressing heavily against her usual resilience. She excused herself early, retreating to her room with strict instructions from Alistair that an additional guard would now be posted directly outside her door throughout the night, a precaution she did not resist, despite the faint sting of vulnerability it represented. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by every small creak of the old manor settling around her, every distant sound from the courtyard below sending her heart racing, before reason reminded her that guards now patrolled where none had before. She thought of her father again, wondering whether he too had lain awake once, sensing danger circling closer without fully understanding its shape, and found herself grateful, despite everything, that she was not facing this particular danger entirely alone. By the time sleep finally claimed her, the moon had shifted well past its highest point, and somewhere beyond the manor's careful new guard, Elena knew with quiet certainty that the danger surrounding them had only just begun to reveal itself. 3 days after the break-in, Alistair received a reply to one of the many careful letters he had sent out under a false business name, designed to draw information from anyone who might have crossed paths with Reginald Ashcombe, or his alias, without revealing the true purpose of the inquiry. The letter came from a merchant named Harold Whitfield, who ran a modest shipping business 2 districts away, and claimed, in cautious and clearly frightened handwriting, that he had lost nearly everything to a man calling himself Reginald Holt, almost 4 years earlier. "He wants to meet," Alistair said, holding the letter out for Elena and Priscilla to read in the library that had become their permanent meeting place over the last several days. "But he insists on discretion. He says he still fears repercussions, even after all this time." Elena read the letter twice, her chest tightening with a painful mixture of validation and sorrow. Harold Whitfield's story, though different in its details, followed a pattern disturbingly similar to her father's own downfall. An investment offer that seemed too generous to refuse, papers signed in haste and trust, and a business slowly, methodically stripped away, until nothing remained but debt and humiliation. "He is not alone then," Priscilla said quietly, reading over Elena's shoulder. "There are others." "I suspected as much," Alistair said. "Men who succeed at fraud on this scale rarely stop after a single success. Reginald has likely been repeating this pattern for years, moving between districts, adopting different names, always careful enough to avoid drawing attention from any single victim, long enough for the pattern to be noticed." "Then we need to speak with him," Elena said immediately. "Today, if possible." "He asked to meet somewhere neutral," Alistair said, glancing back down at the letter. "A tavern near the docks, away from prying eyes. He specifically requested that only 2 of us come, out of fear that a larger group might draw unwanted attention." Elena felt a flicker of unease at the thought of venturing away from the relative safety of the manor, especially after the break-in that had already proven Reginald's willingness to send someone directly into a duke's household. But she also understood with a clarity that had grown sharper over the last several days, that hiding within the manor's walls would accomplish nothing. If they wanted to build a case strong enough to bring real consequences against Reginald, they needed testimony from victims willing to speak, and that meant taking risks. "I will go," she said. "Harold Whitfield deserves to speak with someone who understands exactly what he went through, not simply a Duke's solicitor collecting evidence for a legal case." Alistair studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing the danger against the value of her presence. "I will accompany you," he said finally. "But we will take precautions. No carriage bearing my family crest, no obvious signs of wealth that might draw attention on the road." They left the manor an hour later, dressed plainly, traveling in a modest rented carriage that drew no particular notice as it wound its way through the narrower streets toward the docks. Elena watched the city pass by the window, the grand houses of the wealthy giving way gradually to more modest homes, then to the crowded, busy streets near the water, where fishmongers shouted their prices and dockworkers hauled crates from ship to shore in an endless, practiced rhythm. The tavern, when they reached it, was small and dimly lit, tucked between two warehouses that smelled faintly of salt and tar. Harold Whitfield was already waiting in a corner booth, a thin, nervous man, in his middle years, with tired eyes and hands that trembled slightly around a mug of ale he did not appear to be drinking. "You came alone?" he asked, glancing anxiously toward the door, as Elena and Alistair slid into the booth across from him. "As requested," Alistair said. "You have my word that nothing you say here will be shared beyond what is necessary to build a legitimate case against the man who wronged you." Harold's eyes moved to Elena, taking in her plain clothing and the exhaustion still visible beneath her composed expression. "You're the woman from the wedding," he said. "The seamstress. I heard about what happened. All of the district has heard by now." "My father was destroyed by the same man who nearly married into a respected family days ago," Elena said. "I understand what it feels like to lose everything to someone who smiles while he does it." Harold's shoulders sagged, some of the tension leaving his frame at the sight of genuine understanding rather than mere legal curiosity. He began to speak, slowly at first, then with growing urgency, describing how Reginald Holt had approached him 4 years earlier, with an offer to expand his small shipping business into new coastal routes, how the papers had seemed reasonable at the time, how the betrayal had unfolded slowly enough that he had not fully understood what was happening until it was far too late to stop it. "I lost 2 ships," Harold said, his voice breaking slightly. "My father's ships, passed down through 3 generations. I had to let go of every man who worked for me, men who had families depending on their wages. Some of them never found work again in this district. I carry that weight every single day, knowing their suffering traces back to a decision I made trusting the wrong man." Elena reached across the table, resting her hand briefly over his trembling one, a gesture that seemed to steady him more than any words could have. "It was not your fault," she said quietly. "He is skilled at making good people believe his lies. That is not a flaw in you. It is a flaw in him." Harold nodded slowly, though the guilt in his eyes did not fully fade. "I have documents," he said after a moment, glancing again toward the door before lowering his voice further. "Copies, not originals. I learned, after losing everything, to never let important papers out of a locked drawer. I control myself. I would be willing to share them, if it means he finally faces consequences for what he has done." "That would be extremely valuable," Alistair said. "More valuable than you likely realize. A pattern of fraud across multiple victims strengthens any case far beyond what a single account could accomplish alone." "There is something else," Harold said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I am not the only one Reginald ruined in this district. I know of at least 2 others, though neither has spoken publicly about what happened. Fear keeps most silent. Reginald has always known how to remind people, quietly, of what might happen if they speak too loudly." A chill settled over the table at those words, and Elena exchanged a glance with Alistair, both of them recognizing the implication buried within Harold's careful phrasing. "Has he threatened you directly?" Alistair asked. Harold hesitated, then nodded slightly. "Not in words that could ever be proven in a court of law. He is far too clever for that. But messages have arrived over the years, reminders that certain accidents happen to men who speak too freely about matters better left forgotten. A warehouse fire 2 years ago that conveniently destroyed records belonging to another man who once threatened to speak publicly. A carriage accident that injured a former business partner who had begun asking uncomfortable questions. Elena felt her blood run cold. She thought immediately of the masked intruder who had broken into her room only days earlier, the careful efficiency of his escape, the certainty that he had known exactly where to find her father's papers. If Reginald was truly capable of orchestrating fires and accidents to silence those who threatened him, then the danger surrounding this fight was far greater than she had initially understood. "You believe these were not accidents," Alistair said, his voice carefully neutral, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his growing concern. "I believe nothing that inconvenient for Reginald Ashcombe has ever truly been an accident," Harold said grimly. "I have survived this long by staying quiet, by letting my losses remain simply another sad story of bad business fortune, rather than a crime worth pursuing. I am only speaking now because I heard what happened at the wedding, and because for the first time in 4 years, I believe there might finally be enough power gathered against him to make speaking worthwhile." The weight of his words settled heavily over Elena as they left the tavern an hour later. Harold's copied documents carefully secured within Alistair's coat, promises made to protect his identity as much as possible during whatever legal proceedings followed. The carriage ride back toward the manor felt longer and more oppressive than the journey out had been, both of them lost in their own thoughts, as the docks gave way once more to narrower streets, then to the wider avenues of the wealthier districts. "If what he says is true," Elena said finally, breaking the silence, "then this is far more dangerous than simply exposing a fraudulent marriage. We could be dealing with a man capable of far worse than financial ruin." "I had already suspected as much," Alistair admitted. "Men who build empires on lies rarely limit themselves to a single category of harm when their lies threaten to unravel. I should have been more careful about the risks I was asking you to accept." "You did not ask me to accept anything," Elena said firmly. "I chose this path myself, the moment I walked through those chapel doors. I will not turn back simply because the danger has proven greater than I first realized." Alistair looked at her for a long moment, something complicated passing across his features, admiration tangled together with concern he did not fully try to hide. "Then we will need to be considerably more careful moving forward," he said, "starting with ensuring that whoever broke into your room 3 nights ago does not have another opportunity to finish whatever task Reginald sent him to complete." Elena nodded, staring out the carriage window as the manor finally came into view, its familiar gray stone walls no longer feeling quite as safe as they had only days earlier. Somewhere beyond those walls, Reginald Ashcombe was undoubtedly already working to protect himself, gathering whatever resources and allies remained loyal to him, preparing for a fight that Elena now understood would not end simply because a wedding had been stopped. That evening, Alistair's solicitor arrived at the manor, carrying a leather satchel filled with the copies Harold Whitfield had provided, along with several documents his own careful research had uncovered over the preceding days. Edmund Blythe was a lean, precise man with spectacles perched low on his nose and a manner of speaking that suggested he weighed every word before allowing it past his lips, a habit Elena found reassuring given the gravity of the case they were building. "I have traced 2 additional business ventures connected to the alias Reginald Holt," Blythe reported, spreading a series of papers across the library table for everyone to examine. One involved a wool merchant in the Northern District, whose losses were significant enough that he relocated his entire family, rather than face the shame of his ruin becoming public knowledge. The other involved a smaller case, a widow who lost her late husband's modest savings to what she believed was a safe investment in coastal trade. "Have you spoken with either of them?" Elena asked, leaning forward with interest, despite her exhaustion from the day's events. "Not yet," Blythe said. "I wish to consult with His Grace first, given the delicate nature of approaching victims who may still fear repercussions for speaking. I suspect, given what we witnessed at the tavern with Mr. Whitfield, that direct approaches work best when accompanied by someone who has experienced similar loss themselves, rather than simply a solicitor gathering evidence for a case." Alistair glanced toward Elena, silently asking whether she was willing to take on such a task, and Elena nodded without hesitation, understanding intuitively that her presence had made a genuine difference in earning Harold's trust that afternoon. "I will need addresses," she said, "and perhaps a letter of introduction, something that establishes enough credibility that they do not simply turn me away at the door." assuming I represent some further scheme against them. I can arrange that, Blythe said, already making notes in a small leather journal he carried. Though I would caution patience, fear built over years does not dissolve easily, even in the face of genuine sympathy. Priscilla, who had been quietly listening throughout the exchange, spoke up thoughtfully. Perhaps it would help if I accompanied Elena for at least the visit to the widow, she said. My presence, and the scandal already surrounding my cancelled wedding, might lend additional weight to the idea that Reginald's crimes are finally being taken seriously by people with genuine standing in society. That is generous of you, Elena said, though I worry it might also place you in further danger, given what happened at Harold's warehouse. I have already lost the safety of quiet obscurity, Priscilla said, a wry, tired smile touching her lips. I might as well use what remains of my reputation for something worthwhile. They spent the remainder of the evening organizing their approach, dividing responsibilities carefully between gathering additional testimony, securing the documents already in hand, and preparing formal statements that could withstand the scrutiny of a skeptical magistrate. Elena found herself grateful, watching the careful, methodical way Alistair and his solicitor worked together, for the first time in 3 years, to feel as though the fight for her father's justice was no longer hers to carry entirely alone. It had only just begun. The summons arrived at the manor 2 days later, delivered by a court messenger whose formal uniform seemed to draw every eye in the household the moment he stepped through the front doors. Elena Marchetti was being formally accused of fraud and coercion, the document stated, on the grounds that she had fabricated evidence and forced her way into a private ceremony with the deliberate intent to damage Reginald Ashcombe's reputation and business standing. The claim demanded she appear before the magistrate within the week to answer for these accusations, under threat of arrest should she fail to comply. Elena read the summons twice, her hands trembling with a fury she had not expected to feel so sharply. He is accusing me of the very crime he committed, she said, her voice tight. He destroyed my father's life, and now he wants to punish me for surviving it. This is precisely the kind of tactic I expected from him, Alistair said grimly, taking the summons from her hands to examine it more closely. He cannot disprove the letter itself, so instead, he attacks the messenger who delivered it. If he can convince the magistrate that you acted with malicious intent, he creates enough doubt to protect himself, regardless of what the evidence actually shows. Priscilla, who had joined them in the library the moment word of the summons reached her, looked equally furious, her earlier composure cracking slightly at the sheer audacity of the countercharge. He truly believes he can twist this into a story where you are the villain, and he is simply an innocent man wronged by a stranger's lies. He has done it before, Alistair said. I imagine every previous victim who considered speaking against him faced some version of this same threat, a countercharge severe enough to make silence seem safer than justice. Elena felt the familiar cold weight of fear settling into her stomach, though beneath it, something harder and more determined had begun to grow over the past several days, a resolve that refused to be smothered, simply because the fight had grown more dangerous than she anticipated. Then we answer the summons, she said. We go before the magistrate with everything we have gathered, Harold's testimony, the copied documents, everything. And we let the evidence speak for itself. It will not be simple, Alistair warned. Reginald's family has influence with several magistrates in this district, cultivated over years of careful donations and social favors. We cannot assume the proceedings will be entirely fair, regardless of how strong our evidence proves to be. Before Elena could respond, a sharp knock interrupted them, and one of the household staff entered looking distinctly alarmed. Your Grace, forgive the intrusion, but a rider has just arrived with urgent news. There has been a fire at a warehouse near the docks. The merchant who owns it is asking for you specifically. Elena's blood ran cold. Harold, she breathed. They reached the docks within the hour, the modest carriage racing through streets that seemed to blur past in a frantic haze of worry. Smoke was still rising in thick gray columns from the direction of the warehouse district by the time they arrived, and the acrid smell of burning wood hung heavy in the air, mixing with the salt of the nearby water. Harold Whitfield stood at the edge of a cordoned area, his face streaked with soot and his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and barely controlled fury, watching as the last of the flames were finally brought under control by a team of exhausted firefighters and volunteers. They knew exactly which building to target, Harold said the moment Elena and Alistair reached him, his voice hoarse from smoke and shouting. Every document I kept, every copy of the papers I gave you, gone. I managed to save nothing beyond the clothes I was wearing when the fire started." "Was anyone hurt?" Elena asked immediately, gripping his arm. "No," Harold said, some of the tension in his shoulders easing slightly at the concern in her voice. "I was fortunate enough to be at home when it started. But make no mistake, this was no accident. I found the remains of a broken lantern near the warehouse's rear entrance, in a spot no lantern should ever have been left." Alistair's expression had gone hard and cold, the calm authority Elena had come to associate with him replaced by something far more dangerous, a controlled fury that radiated from him despite his measured stillness. "This confirms exactly what we suspected," he said. "Reginald is no longer simply trying to protect his reputation through legal maneuvering. He has moved to destroying evidence directly and endangering lives to do it." "Fortunately," Harold said, managing a thin, exhausted smile despite everything, "I learned from my earlier mistakes. I kept a second set of copies with a solicitor 2 districts away, someone with no connection to Reginald or his associates. I did not trust even my own warehouse to keep everything safe." Relief washed through Elena at his words, though it did little to ease the deeper fear now settled firmly in her chest. If Reginald was willing to burn down an entire warehouse to destroy evidence, what might he be willing to do to silence the people carrying that evidence forward? "You need protection," Alistair said firmly to Harold. "Immediately. I will arrange for guards to be stationed at your home until this matter is fully resolved, before the magistrate." Harold hesitated, clearly torn between gratitude and the deep-seated fear that had kept him silent for 4 long years. "I never wanted to become the center of anyone's attention," he admitted quietly. "I simply wanted my losses acknowledged, someday, by someone with the power to do something about it." "You are not alone in this fight any longer," Elena said, squeezing his arm gently. "We will see this through together, all of us." As the smoke continued to clear over the ruined warehouse, Elena found herself studying the destruction with a strange, steady clarity. Reginald had shown his hand now, more dangerously than ever before, and in doing so, he had made a critical mistake. Fear could keep victims silent for years, but violence against innocent people, once witnessed by enough onlookers, had a way of turning quiet sympathy into open outrage. Already, a small crowd of dock workers and neighboring merchants had gathered to watch the aftermath of the fire, their whispered conversations carrying fragments of suspicion and anger that Elena suspected would spread through the district by nightfall, just as the story of the ruined wedding had spread only days earlier. "He is making enemies faster than he can manage them," Alistair observed quietly, as though reading her thoughts. "A man desperate to silence every threat eventually creates more threats than he can control." They returned to the manor that evening, with grim determination rather than despair. The destroyed warehouse, serving not as a defeat, but as further proof of exactly how far Reginald was willing to go to protect the empire of lies he had built. Priscilla, upon hearing the news, immediately began drafting letters to several influential families she trusted, quietly gathering support and allies who might prove useful when the case finally reached the magistrate's chambers. "We cannot rely on the magistrate alone," she said that evening, gathered once more in the library that had become the true heart of their unlikely alliance. "If Reginald has cultivated favor among certain officials, we need public opinion strong enough that no magistrate could dismiss this case without facing consequences of his own." "A dangerous strategy," Alistair said, though there was clear respect in his voice. "Public opinion can be a powerful weapon, but it can also turn unpredictable and difficult to control." "Better an unpredictable weapon than silence," Priscilla replied firmly. Elena listened to their exchange with quiet admiration, marveling at how quickly this unlikely group had assembled itself. A duke motivated by both justice and a growing personal interest he had not yet fully named. A jilted bride transformed by betrayal into a formidable ally, and a frightened merchant finally finding the courage to speak after years of silence. Late that night, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion weighing heavily on her body, Elena found herself wandering down to the library, drawn by the flickering glow of firelight beneath the door. She found Alistair there alone, reviewing documents by lamplight, his sleeves rolled up and his usually immaculate composure softened by fatigue. "You should be resting," she said quietly from the doorway. "So should you," he replied, glancing up with a tired but genuine smile. Yet here we both are. Elena stepped into the room, settling into the chair across from him. Do you regret it? She asked. Involving yourself so deeply in this. You could have simply walked away after the wedding ended. No one would have blamed you for staying out of the rest of this fight. Alistair set down the papers in his hands, considering the question with the same careful thoughtfulness he brought to everything. I have spent a great deal of my life protected from consequences that ordinary people cannot escape, he said finally. My title has shielded me from difficulties that destroyed men like your father and Harold Whitfield. I do not regret using that same shield now. Finally, to protect people who deserve protection far more than I ever needed it myself. Elena studied him in the warm firelight, seeing beyond the Duke's calm authority to something more vulnerable beneath it, a man who had clearly spent years wrestling with the weight of privilege he had not chosen, but could not ignore. My father used to say that the measure of a person is not what they do when everyone is watching, but what they do when no one requires it of them, she said quietly. Then I hope I am measuring up, Alistair said, his voice softer than she had heard it before. You are, Elena said, and found, to her quiet surprise, that she meant it completely. They sat together a while longer, the fire slowly burning down to embers, and Elena found herself telling him small, ordinary stories about her father, memories she had not shared with anyone since his passing, the way he used to hum old work songs while measuring fabric, the careful patience he showed with difficult customers, the small kindnesses he extended to apprentices who could not otherwise afford proper training. Alistair listened without interrupting, occasionally asking a gentle question that showed he was truly absorbing every word rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. He sounds like he was a remarkable man, Alistair said eventually. I regret never having the chance to meet him. I think he would have liked you, Elena said, surprising herself with the admission, despite the title. He always said a person's character showed most clearly in how they treated those who could offer them nothing in return. Then I hope I continue to earn that good opinion, Alistair said quietly, even from beyond it. Elena smiled, the warmth of the dying fire and the comfort of shared memory, easing some of the day's lingering tension from her shoulders. It struck her, sitting there in the quiet library so late into the night, how strange and unexpected this entire journey had become. How a single desperate act in a chapel had led her not only toward justice for her father, but toward a friendship, and perhaps something more, that she had never anticipated finding again after so many years spent guarding her heart against further loss. The following morning, Elena and Priscilla traveled together to visit the widow Blythe had identified, a quiet woman named Margaret Holloway, who lived in a modest cottage on the edge of the district, far removed from the grand houses and busy markets that defined most of the city's social life. She answered her door cautiously, her eyes widening with visible alarm at the sight of Priscilla's fine carriage waiting at the end of her lane, clearly assuming some manner of trouble had arrived at her doorstep. We mean you no harm, Elena said gently, before the widow could retreat back inside. My name is Elena Marchetti. I believe we may share a difficult history, both of us wronged by the same man. It took considerable patience and careful, honest conversation before Margaret Holloway finally invited them inside, her small parlor sparse but scrupulously clean, evidence of a woman who had rebuilt her life carefully after losing nearly everything years earlier. She listened with growing recognition as Elena described her father's story, her hands trembling slightly around a chipped teacup as the parallels to her own late husband's ruin became increasingly undeniable. I believed it was simply bad fortune, Margaret said quietly, once Elena had finished speaking. My husband trusted a man who seemed so genuinely interested in helping us secure our future. I never imagined it might have been deliberate cruelty rather than simple misfortune. You are not alone in that belief, Priscilla said gently. Many good people trusted him precisely because he was skilled at appearing trustworthy. That skill does not make your husband foolish, it makes Reginald dangerous. By the time they left Margaret Holloway's cottage that afternoon, she had agreed, cautiously but genuinely, to provide a written statement describing her husband's losses, along with whatever documentation she still retained from the original investment agreement. It was another crucial piece, added to the growing case against Reginald, another voice, added to the chorus, that would soon prove impossible for any magistrate to dismiss as simple coincidence or misfortune. Outside, the city continued its restless hum, unaware that within these library walls, an alliance forged from tragedy and courage, was steadily growing strong enough to finally challenge a man who had believed, for far too long, that he was untouchable. 2 days before the magistrate hearing, Elena insisted on visiting the small rented room she had called home for the past 3 years, needing to collect a few personal belongings and, more importantly, needing a quiet moment away from the constant activity of the manor to gather her thoughts before facing Reginald in a formal courtroom. Alistair had wanted to accompany her, but Elena had gently refused, insisting that a duke's presence in her modest neighborhood would draw far more attention than she wished to attract on what she hoped would be an unremarkable errand. Instead, one of the manor's trusted guards, a quiet, capable young man named Peter Langley, accompanied her at a respectful distance, close enough to intervene if necessary but far enough to allow her the illusion of privacy. The walk to her rented room took her through familiar streets, past the small bakery where she had bought bread every morning for years, past the Tailors' Guild Hall, where her father's name had once been spoken with respect, before Reginald's scheme reduced it to a cautionary whisper. Everything looked the same as it always had, and yet Elena felt entirely changed, as though the woman who had lived quietly in these streets only weeks earlier belonged to a different lifetime altogether. She was halfway up the narrow staircase leading to her room when she first noticed the man loitering near the building's entrance, his posture too deliberately casual, his eyes tracking her movements with an attention that made the hair on her arms rise. She continued up the stairs without acknowledging him, her heartbeat quickening as old instincts, sharpened considerably over the past several weeks, urged her toward caution. Inside her room, she gathered a few items quickly: a worn shawl that had belonged to her mother, a small box of letters her father had written her during a brief period apart years earlier, and found herself glancing repeatedly toward the window, half expecting to see the loitering man still watching from below. He was gone when she finally looked, and for a moment, relief loosened the tension in her shoulders. It did not last. She heard footsteps on the staircase, too quick and heavy to belong to any of her usual neighbors, and her pulse spiked with alarm as she recognized the deliberate pace of someone climbing with purpose rather than habit. She had only seconds to decide whether to hide, wait, or act. She chose to act. Elena grabbed the small iron poker resting beside her cold, unused fireplace and positioned herself beside the door, her breath held tight in her chest as the footsteps grew louder, then stopped just outside her room. The handle turned slowly, testing whether the door had been locked, and Elena's grip on the poker tightened as the door began to creak open. She struck the moment a figure stepped through the doorway, her aim driven more by fear than precision, catching the intruder across the shoulder hard enough to make him stumble backward with a pained shout. She recognized him instantly as the same man who had been loitering near the entrance, his face now twisted with surprise and anger, rather than the calm menace he had worn moments before. "Guard!" Elena screamed, backing away as the man recovered his footing, his hand reaching toward something concealed beneath his coat. Peter Langley arrived within seconds, having heard her cry from his post near the street entrance, and the sight of the young guard's broad shoulders filling the doorway seemed to shift the intruder's calculations entirely. He hesitated only a moment before shoving past Peter and fleeing down the staircase, his footsteps clattering rapidly toward the street below. "Are you hurt?" Peter asked urgently, gripping Elena's shoulders as she stood trembling, the poker still clutched tightly in her white-knuckled hands. "No," Elena managed, though her voice shook considerably. "He didn't touch me. I struck him first." Peter's expression tightened with grim satisfaction. "Good. His Grace will want to know about this immediately." They returned to the manor within the hour, Elena's hands still trembling slightly despite her outward composure, and the moment Alistair saw her face, he crossed the room in swift, urgent strides, his usual careful restraint entirely abandoned. "What happened?" he demanded, his gray eyes searching her face and posture for any sign of injury. "A man followed me to my room," Elena said, forcing her voice to remain steady, even as the memory of those tense, frightening moments replayed vividly in her mind. "He tried to enter while I was inside. I struck him with a fireplace poker before Peter arrived." Something dangerous flickered across Alistair's expression, a fury Elena had not seen from him before, controlled but unmistakable. "This ends now," he said, his voice low and hard. "I will not allow him to threaten your safety any further, hearing or no hearing." "What will you do?" Elena asked. I will use every resource available to me to ensure Reginald Ashcombe understands, in terms he cannot possibly misinterpret, that further attempts against anyone connected to this case will be met with consequences far beyond a courtroom summons, Alistair said. Priscilla, who had joined them upon hearing the commotion, looked equally alarmed, though her mind moved quickly toward practical solutions rather than dwelling on fear. We need to bring this incident before the magistrate as well, she said. An attempted assault against a witness, only 2 days before a scheduled hearing, speaks volumes about the legitimacy of Reginald's countercharges against her. I agree, Alistair said. I will have Peter provide a formal statement immediately, along with a description of the man involved. If we are fortunate, this incident alone may be enough to have the fraud charges against Elena dismissed before the hearing even properly begins. That evening, as the manor settled into its usual quiet rhythm, despite the tension still humming beneath the surface, Elena found herself unable to shake the lingering fear from the day's events. She sat alone in the small guest room she had occupied for nearly 2 weeks now, staring at the window latch, checking twice that it remained securely fastened before finally allowing herself to consider sleep. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts, and she found Alistair standing in the corridor when she opened it, his expression carefully composed, but his eyes betraying genuine concern beneath the surface. I wanted to check on you myself, he said. Peter's report was thorough, but I found myself needing to see for certain that you were truly unharmed. I am fine, Elena said, though the slight tremor still present in her voice suggested otherwise. Frightened, perhaps, but unharmed. You have every right to be frightened, Alistair said. What you did today, defending yourself alone against a man clearly sent to silence or harm you, took considerable courage. I do not wish for you to feel that courage must extend to facing every danger without support. Elena looked at him for a long moment, struck once again by the strange, quiet intimacy that had grown between them over these past difficult weeks, born not from romance in any traditional sense, but from the shared weight of fighting for something they both believed mattered deeply. Do you remember what you said to me, that rainy afternoon at my aunt's inn? She asked. Before you knew I would ever matter to your life beyond a single evening's shelter from the storm. Alistair considered the question, a faint, thoughtful smile touching his lips. I believe I complained rather extensively about the state of the roads in this region. You also told me, Elena continued, that you envied how plainly I spoke to you, how I treated you, as simply another traveler, rather than someone whose opinion required careful management. You said it was rare, in your life, to be spoken to honestly. I remember, Alistair said quietly. I am speaking to you honestly now, Elena said. I am frightened, but I do not regret a single choice that has led me here, and I do not intend to stop, simply because the path has grown more dangerous than I first believed. Alistair studied her, with an expression she could not entirely read, something between admiration and a deeper, more complicated emotion. He seemed determined not to name aloud. Not yet. Not while danger still hung so heavily over everything they had built together in these short weeks. Then we will face whatever comes together, he said finally. Starting with the hearing, in 2 days' time. Elena nodded, and though fear still lingered in her chest, she found it tempered now by something steadier, a resolve reinforced, rather than diminished, by the day's frightening events. Reginald had sent a man to silence her, and she had refused to be silenced. Whatever the magistrate's hearing might bring, she intended to walk into that courtroom exactly as she had walked into the chapel weeks earlier, unwilling to let fear dictate the course of her own life any longer. Behind Alistair's careful composure, she sensed a similar resolve hardening. A duke who had spent years observing injustice from a comfortable distance, now fully, irrevocably committed to seeing it corrected, regardless of what it cost him personally to do so. Neither of them spoke of what might come after the hearing concluded, whether justice was finally served or delayed further by Reginald's considerable influence. For tonight, it was enough simply to stand together in the quiet corridor, two people who had found, unexpectedly, that courage grew considerably easier to carry when it was no longer carried entirely alone. The following day brought a flurry of final preparations. Edmund Blythe, arriving early, with a thick folder of organized testimony, financial records, and formal statements collected over the preceding weeks, from Harold Whitfield, Margaret Holloway, and 2 additional victims, who had come forward after hearing of the growing case against Reginald. Blythe walked Elena carefully through the questions she was likely to face during her own testimony, coaching her on how to remain steady and precise, even when Reginald's counsel attempted to provoke an emotional reaction that might undermine her credibility. "They will try to paint you as vengeful," Blythe warned her, pacing slowly before the library fireplace as he spoke. "They will suggest your grief has clouded your judgment, that you have constructed an elaborate story to punish a man for your father's own poor decisions. You must resist the urge to respond with anger, however justified that anger may be. Calm, steady testimony carries far more weight before a magistrate than passionate outrage, however deserved." Elena absorbed his guidance carefully, practicing her responses aloud until the words felt natural rather than rehearsed, until she could recount her father's story without her voice trembling, without her hands curling into fists at the memory of everything Reginald had taken from her family. Priscilla, meanwhile, worked alongside her own household solicitor to prepare a formal account of the documents she had discovered in Reginald's study months earlier, careful to establish a clear timeline that would withstand any attempt by Drake to suggest she had fabricated her recollections after the fact to support Elena's claims. "I want to be certain my testimony strengthens the case rather than becoming a distraction from it," Priscilla said, reviewing her prepared statement with visible determination. "Reginald will undoubtedly attempt to paint me as a jilted, embarrassed woman, seeking revenge rather than truth. I intend to give him nothing to work with." Alistair, for his part, spent much of the day in quiet consultation with several contacts he had cultivated across the district's legal community, gathering intelligence about Magistrate Whitmore's reputation and habits, hoping to anticipate how the man might respond to the various strategies Reginald's counsel could attempt to employ. "He is known for valuing procedure above sentiment," Alistair reported that evening, gathering everyone once more in the library for a final review before the hearing. "This works in our favor, provided our evidence remains meticulously organized and our testimony consistent. He is far less likely to be swayed by Reginald's charm or Drake's rhetorical flourishes than by the simple, undeniable weight of documented fact." Elena listened to the careful strategizing with a strange mixture of anxiety and steady resolve, aware that tomorrow would likely determine not only her own fate, but the fate of every victim who had trusted her enough to add their voice to this fight. She thought of her father again, as she so often did during these tense, uncertain days, wondering whether he would recognize the woman she had become, whether he would be proud of the courage she had found buried somewhere beneath years of quiet grief. She believed, with a certainty that steadied her more than any rehearsed testimony could, that he would be. The magistrate's chamber was packed beyond its usual capacity on the morning of the hearing, word of the scandal having spread so thoroughly through the district that curious onlookers had begun arriving hours before the doors officially opened, hoping to secure a seat for what many were already calling the most talked-about case the city had seen in years. Elena sat beside Alistair's solicitor at a long wooden table, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from trembling, while across the aisle, Reginald sat with his own legal counsel, his expression composed into a mask of wounded dignity that Elena recognized now as nothing more than practiced performance. Magistrate Aldous Whitmore presided over the proceedings from an elevated bench at the front of the chamber, a stern-faced man in his 60s, whose reputation, according to Alistair's careful inquiries, suggested neither particular corruption nor particular courage, a man who followed procedure closely and rarely deviated from established expectation. Whether that made him an ally or an obstacle remained to be seen. "We are here," Magistrate Whitmore began, his voice carrying clearly through the crowded chamber, "to address two connected matters. First, an accusation of fraud and coercion brought by Lord Reginald Ashcombe against Miss Elena Marchetti. Second, evidence presented by Miss Marchetti alleging financial fraud committed by Lord Ashcombe under the alias Reginald Holt, resulting in significant harm to multiple victims." Reginald's solicitor rose first, a sharp-featured man named Cornelius Drake, who Elena had learned, through Alistair's careful investigation, had represented several of Reginald's business dealings over the years, always with suspicious success, despite frequently questionable circumstances. "Your Honor," Drake began, "my client is the true victim in this matter, Miss Marchetti, driven by grief following her father's unfortunate business failures, has constructed an elaborate fiction, naming Lord Ashcombe as responsible for losses that were in truth simply the result of poor financial decisions made independently by her late father. Elena felt anger flare hot in her chest, but she kept her expression carefully neutral, exactly as Alistair had coached her during the long hours of preparation leading up to this moment. Losing composure now, in front of a room full of onlookers eager for any excuse to dismiss her claims, would only strengthen Reginald's carefully constructed narrative. She then compounded this fiction, Drake continued, by forcing her way into a private wedding ceremony, causing significant public humiliation and financial damage to my client's reputation, damage that has already cost him several important business relationships. Your Honor, Alistair's solicitor rose in response, a measured man named Edmund Blythe, who had served the Thornleigh family for over a decade. The defense would like to present documentary evidence, establishing a clear pattern of fraud committed by Lord Ashcombe under the alias in question, evidence that extends well beyond Miss Marchetti's individual claim. What followed was nearly 3 hours of careful, methodical presentation, Blythe walking the magistrate through the original papers Elena's father had kept, the copied documents recovered before Harold Whitfield's warehouse burned, and testimony from 2 additional victims who had come forward in the days following the warehouse fire, encouraged by news of the growing case against Reginald. Harold Whitfield himself testified midway through the proceedings, his voice steady despite visible nervousness, describing in careful detail the scheme that had cost him 2 ships and his father's shipping legacy. When Drake attempted to discredit his testimony by suggesting business failure rather than fraud, Harold produced additional correspondence he had preserved with his distant solicitor, correspondence that clearly showed Reginald's deliberate manipulation of contract terms, designed to appear legitimate, while systematically transferring ownership away from unsuspecting victims. The chamber's mood shifted visibly as the testimony accumulated, murmurs of outrage replacing the earlier skeptical whispers that had greeted Elena's initial claims. Even Magistrate Whitmore's stern expression had begun to soften into something closer to genuine concern as the pattern of Reginald's deception became increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence or simple bad fortune. Then Drake called his final witness, and Elena's stomach dropped with dread. The defense calls upon Mr. Aaron Kessler, Drake announced, and a thin, nervous-looking man rose from the gallery, making his way slowly toward the witness stand, under the weight of every eye in the chamber. Elena did not recognize the name, though Alistair leaned toward her, his expression tightening with quiet alarm. He is one of Reginald's known associates, he whispered, a man my investigation identified as possibly involved in his schemes, though I could never confirm his exact role. Kessler took the stand with visible reluctance, and under Drake's careful questioning, began to describe Elena's father as a man burdened by significant personal debts, entirely unrelated to any business dealings with Reginald, debts accumulated through what Kessler claimed were reckless gambling habits that had nothing to do with the tailoring shop's eventual collapse. The accusation struck Elena like a physical blow. She had spent 3 years mourning a father she had always believed to be an honest, hard-working man, and now, in front of a chamber full of strangers, that memory was being deliberately, cruelly tarnished to protect the very man responsible for his ruin. "That is a lie," she said aloud, before she could stop herself, rising from her seat, despite Blythe's cautioning hand on her arm. "Miss Marchetti," Magistrate Whitmore said sharply, "you will have the opportunity to respond through proper testimony. Please remain seated." Elena forced herself back into her chair, her hands trembling with restrained fury, while Kessler continued his fabricated account, painting Giovanni Marchetti as a man whose downfall had nothing to do with fraud and everything to do with his own poor choices. When Blythe finally rose to question the witness, his approach was calm and methodical, exposing gradually the significant gaps and inconsistencies in Kessler's story, particularly regarding the precise timeline of the supposed gambling debts, which failed to align neatly with the documented transfer of ownership recorded in Elena's father's original papers. "Mr. Kessler," Blythe said, his voice carrying a deceptively mild tone that Elena had learned over the preceding weeks meant he had found exactly the weakness he had been searching for. "Can you explain how you came to possess such detailed knowledge of Giovanni Marchetti's personal financial habits, given that you have testified you never personally met the man?" Kessler hesitated, his composure faltering visibly for the first time. "I heard about it, through business circles. he said finally, though the answer sounded rehearsed rather than genuine. From whom, specifically? Blythe pressed. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long, and Elena watched with grim satisfaction as Kessler's eyes darted briefly toward Reginald, seeking guidance that could not be openly given in the middle of a formal hearing. I do not recall the specific source, Kessler finally admitted, his voice notably less confident than it had been minutes earlier. Interesting, Blythe said quietly, that such specific, damaging details about a deceased man's private financial affairs would come from a source you cannot recall, presented at precisely the moment they are needed, to discredit his daughter's testimony against your associate, Lord Ashcombe. Drake attempted to object, but Magistrate Whitmore raised a hand, silencing him with a single stern glance. The witness's credibility has been reasonably challenged, the magistrate said. I will weigh this testimony accordingly. As the hearing continued into its final hour, Elena finally took the stand herself. Her earlier fury settled now into a steady, quiet resolve. She spoke plainly, exactly as she had in the chapel weeks earlier, describing her father's honest character, the pride he took in his craft, and the devastating transformation that had occurred only after Reginald entered his life with false promises of expanded opportunity. My father was not a perfect man, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber. But he was honest, and he worked with his hands every single day of his life to provide for our family. He did not gamble away 30 years of careful work. He trusted a stranger who smiled while systematically destroying everything my father had built, and that stranger sits across this room from me today. The chamber remained silent for a long moment after she finished speaking, and Elena felt, for the first time since the ordeal began, a genuine sense that the truth she had carried for so long had finally, fully landed exactly where it needed to. Before the recess was called, Margaret Holloway rose to give her own testimony, her voice trembling at first, but growing steadier, with each sentence, as she described the modest savings her late husband had entrusted to a charming stranger, who had promised safety and growth, only to vanish, with nearly everything they had built together, over 20 years of careful marriage. Drake attempted to suggest her husband's death, occurring only months after the investment, had left her too grief-stricken to accurately recall the details of the arrangement, but Blythe countered swiftly with the original correspondence Margaret had preserved, correspondence bearing the same distinctive handwriting found in Elena's father's documents and Harold Whitfield's records alike. 3 separate victims, Blythe said, addressing the magistrate directly, as he laid the samples side by side upon the table, each entering into agreements years apart, in different districts, with different professions, and different circumstances, yet each bearing the unmistakable signature of the same man, operating under a false identity. This is not coincidence, Your Honor. This is a documented pattern of deliberate, calculated fraud. Reginald's composure had begun visibly fraying by this point, his earlier confident denials replaced by a rigid, brittle silence, as witness after witness added their voice to the mounting evidence against him. Elena watched him closely from across the chamber, searching for any trace of the charming, confident man who had once fooled her father so completely, and found instead only a cornered figure whose carefully constructed world was collapsing piece by piece before an audience of his own choosing. Magistrate Whitmore called for a brief recess before delivering his ruling, and as the chamber slowly emptied into the corridor outside, Elena found herself standing beside Alistair, both of them silent, waiting for the verdict that would determine far more than simply the outcome of a single legal dispute. During the recess, Elena stepped away from the crowded corridor, seeking a quiet moment near a window overlooking the courthouse gardens, needing space to breathe after the intensity of the morning's proceedings. Harold Whitfield found her there a few minutes later, his own nerves clearly frayed despite the courage he had shown on the witness stand. Whatever happens now, he said, joining her at the window, I want you to know that speaking today, finally, after 4 years of silence, has already changed something in me. I do not know if the magistrate will rule in our favor, but I no longer feel like a man carrying a secret shame. I feel like a man who finally told the truth. That matters more than any single ruling, Elena said, squeezing his arm gently. Regardless of what happens next, you have already reclaimed something Reginald tried to take from you. Margaret Holloway joined them, shortly after, her earlier nervousness replaced by a quiet, steady dignity, that seemed to have grown throughout the morning's proceedings. "I have not felt this light in years," she admitted softly. "Even the fear feels different now, shared rather than carried alone." Elena looked between them, this small, unlikely group of survivors who had found each other through shared tragedy, and felt a fierce, protective gratitude swell in her chest. Whatever the magistrate ultimately decided, something important had already shifted among them, a collective courage forged from individual suffering that no ruling, however disappointing, could fully undo. Alistair found her again as the corridor began to stir, with word that the magistrate was ready to resume, his expression carefully composed, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed his own quiet anxiety. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "you have already accomplished something remarkable today. The truth is no longer buried. Regardless of the magistrate's specific ruling, everyone in that chamber now understands exactly what kind of man Reginald Ashcombe truly is." Elena nodded, though her heart still pounded with anxious uncertainty as they waited for the doors to open once more, calling them back inside to hear whether justice, so long delayed for her father and so many others, would finally, truly be served. The doors to the magistrate's chamber opened after nearly an hour of tense waiting, and the crowd that had spilled out into the corridor surged back inside with an eagerness that Elena found almost unbearable, given the weight of what was about to be decided. She took her seat beside Blythe once more, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had gone pale, while across the aisle, Reginald sat with a composure that Elena suspected was far more fragile than it appeared, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed straight ahead rather than meeting anyone's gaze directly. Magistrate Whitmore settled into his elevated seat, a stack of papers arranged neatly before him, and the chamber fell into a silence so complete that Elena could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. "This case presents a troubling pattern of evidence," the magistrate began, his voice measured and deliberate. "Having reviewed the documentation presented by the defense, including original papers, corroborating testimony from multiple independent witnesses, and financial records tracing a consistent method of fraud across several years and several victims, I find the accusations against Miss Elena Marchetti to be entirely without merit." A wave of relief washed through Elena so powerfully that she nearly wept right there in the crowded chamber, though she forced herself to remain composed, aware of the many eyes still watching her closely. "Furthermore," the magistrate continued, and the room seemed to hold its breath collectively, "the evidence presented, regarding Lord Reginald Ashcombe's activities, under the alias Reginald Holt, establishes a clear and troubling pattern of deliberate financial fraud, resulting in significant, documented harm to multiple victims, including the late Giovanni Marchetti and the merchant Harold Whitfield, both of whom lost substantial property and livelihood as a direct result of deceptive contracts designed specifically to obscure their true purpose." Reginald's composed mask finally cracked, his face draining of color as the magistrate's words settled the fate he had spent weeks desperately trying to avoid. "I am referring this matter immediately to the criminal courts for full prosecution," Magistrate Whitmore continued. "Given the scale and deliberate nature of the fraud involved, as well as troubling evidence suggesting witness intimidation and the deliberate destruction of evidence through arson, a matter I understand is already under separate investigation by the city guard." Gasps rippled through the chamber, followed by a swelling murmur of voices that grew louder, despite the magistrate's attempts to call for order. Elena felt tears finally slip free, though they were tears of overwhelming relief rather than sorrow. 3 years of grief and injustice finally, fully acknowledged by someone with the power to act on it. "Additionally," the magistrate said, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the growing noise, "I am ordering the immediate freezing of all assets connected to Lord Ashcombe's business dealings, pending a full investigation into the extent of his fraudulent activities, and I strongly recommend that any additional victims who have not yet come forward do so promptly, given the substantial evidence now formally established in this case." Near the back of the chamber, Elena noticed Aaron Kessler sitting rigidly in his seat, his earlier fabricated testimony now thoroughly discredited before the entire room. His eyes darted nervously toward the exit, and Elena wondered, watching him, whether guilt or simple self-preservation might eventually drive him to abandon his loyalty to Reginald entirely, a suspicion that would prove accurate in the weeks that followed, when Kessler quietly approached the city guard seeking leniency in exchange for information about the wider scope of Reginald's schemes. Reginald rose from his seat abruptly, his composure entirely abandoned now, his voice rising in a desperate attempt to salvage something from the ruins of his carefully constructed reputation. "Your Honor, this is an outrage, a conspiracy orchestrated by a jealous woman, and a duke with his own grudge against—" "You will remain silent, Lord Ashcombe," Magistrate Whitmore said sharply, his earlier measured tone replaced by unmistakable authority, "or I will have you removed from this chamber and held in contempt. The evidence in this case speaks for itself, regardless of whatever conspiracy you might wish to invent to explain your own actions." City guards moved forward at the magistrate's signal, and Elena watched, with a complicated mixture of vindication and something surprisingly close to pity, as Reginald was formally taken into custody to await the criminal proceedings that would follow, his desperate protests trailing behind him as he was led from the chamber. The same confident charm that had once fooled her father, Harold Whitfield, and countless others, now stripped away entirely, revealing nothing beneath it but panic and hollow denial. The chamber erupted into a flood of conversation the moment the doors closed behind him, reporters and onlookers alike rushing to discuss what had just unfolded, though Elena barely registered any of it, still processing the magnitude of what had finally, truly been accomplished. "It's over," she said quietly, turning to Alistair, who had remained close beside her throughout the entire proceeding. "This part is over," Alistair corrected gently. "The criminal case will take time, and there will undoubtedly be further complications as his associates attempt to distance themselves from his actions. But yes, the truth has finally been formally recognized. Your father's name will be cleared." Elena felt her chest tighten with an overwhelming rush of emotion. 3 years of carrying her father's tarnished memory, finally beginning to lift, replaced by something lighter, something that felt almost unfamiliar, after so long spent under grief's heavy weight. Harold Whitfield approached them moments later, his own eyes bright with tears he made no effort to hide. "I never believed I would see this day," he said, his voice thick with emotion. 4 years of silence, 4 years of believing my losses would simply be forgotten, and now, finally, someone with power has said, publicly, that what happened to me was wrong. "You were brave to come forward," Elena said, embracing him warmly. "None of this would have been possible without your testimony." "Nor without yours," Harold replied. "We carried this burden together, in the end, even though we began as strangers." Priscilla joined them shortly after, having watched the proceedings from the gallery, with the same quiet, fierce satisfaction that had defined her transformation over the past several weeks. "I have already begun drafting a public statement," she said, clarifying exactly why my wedding was called off, and making certain the true story reaches every household in this district, before Reginald's associates have the chance to twist it into something else. "You have done more for this cause than anyone could have reasonably expected from a woman whose own wedding was destroyed in the process," Alistair said, genuine admiration clear in his voice. "I did not lose a husband today," Priscilla said, a small, tired smile crossing her face for the first time in weeks. "I lost a man I never truly knew, and gained instead the clarity to build a life built on truth rather than careful, comfortable lies. I consider that an even trade, in the end." As the chamber slowly emptied around them, the crowd's excited chatter following Reginald's departure like ripples spreading outward from a stone dropped into still water, Elena found herself standing quietly beside Alistair, both of them finally allowing themselves a moment of stillness after weeks of relentless danger and determination. "What will you do now?" Alistair asked, his voice softer than the formal tone he had maintained throughout the hearing. Elena considered the question carefully, surprised to realize she did not have an immediate answer. For 3 years, her entire existence had been shaped around grief and the quiet, burning need for justice her father had never received. Now that justice had finally, formally arrived, she found herself facing a strange, unfamiliar openness, a future no longer defined solely by loss and anger. "I do not entirely know," she admitted. "For so long, I could not imagine my life beyond proving what Reginald did to my father. Now that it has been proven, I find myself uncertain what comes next." "Perhaps," Alistair said carefully, "that uncertainty does not need to be frightening. Perhaps it can simply be an opportunity, for the first time in years, to consider what you actually want, rather than what grief demanded of you. Elena looked at him, struck once again by the quiet steadiness that had carried her through the most difficult weeks of her life. A stranger from a rainy afternoon 2 years earlier, who had become, somehow, one of the most important people in her life, without either of them fully planning for it to happen. "And what do you want, Your Grace?" she asked softly. Alistair was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly in her chest. "I want," he said finally, "to continue the honest conversations we began at your aunt's inn 2 years ago, without the weight of titles or investigations, or courtroom dramas standing between us. I want to know the woman who spoke to me plainly about weak tea, without any obligation to defend her father's memory or expose anyone's crimes." Elena felt warmth spread through her chest, gentle and unfamiliar after so many weeks spent consumed entirely by fear and determination. "I believe," she said softly, "that woman would very much like that as well." That evening, word of the ruling spread through the city with astonishing speed, exactly as Priscilla had hoped it would. By the time Elena returned to the manor, messengers had already begun arriving, with notes of support from families she had never met, some offering sympathy, others cautiously admitting they too had suspected wrongdoing in past dealings with men who bore some resemblance to Reginald's careful charm, though none had ever found the courage to speak until now. Margaret Holloway sent a brief, heartfelt letter thanking Elena for giving her the courage to finally speak the truth she had carried silently for years, expressing hope that her late husband's memory might now rest more easily, freed from the quiet shame that had followed his death. Elena read the letter twice, tears gathering in her eyes, at the realization of how far the consequences of her father's courage, and her own, had rippled outward into lives she had never expected to touch. Alistair found her later that evening in the library, the letter still resting in her lap as she stared into the fire, lost in quiet reflection. "You look thoughtful," he observed, settling into the chair across from her. "I keep thinking of everyone whose lives were touched by this," Elena said softly. "My father, Harold, Margaret, and surely others we have not yet found. I never imagined, walking into that chapel weeks ago, that speaking my own truth might help so many others finally speak theirs as well. That is often how justice works, when it finally arrives," Alistair said. "One brave voice creates space for others who had none." Elena looked at him, grateful beyond words for the steady presence he had become in her life, though she said nothing further that evening, content simply to sit together in the firelight, both of them quietly absorbing the enormous weight that had finally, truly, lifted from her shoulders. Outside the magistrate's chamber, the city continued its restless rhythm, unaware that within these walls, a long chapter of grief and injustice had finally, truly closed, making quiet room for whatever unexpected new beginning might follow in its place. 6 months passed before Elena finally stood once more in front of the small shop on Wexford Lane, though this time she held a set of keys in her own hand, rather than a folded letter clutched tightly against fear and grief. The criminal proceedings against Reginald Ashcombe had concluded 3 weeks earlier. The full extent of his fraudulent dealings finally laid bare before the courts, revealing a pattern of deception that stretched across nearly 8 years and touched the lives of 11 confirmed victims, with investigators suspecting several more had simply never come forward. He had been sentenced to a lengthy term of imprisonment, his considerable fortune seized and redistributed among those he had wronged, a small but meaningful measure of restitution for years of suffering that could never be fully repaid. Cornelius Drake, his solicitor, had also faced consequences of his own, disbarred after evidence emerged proving his knowing participation in several of Reginald's fraudulent schemes. Aaron Kessler, the witness whose fabricated testimony had nearly derailed the hearing, ultimately confessed to his role in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing additional evidence that helped secure convictions against 2 other associates who had quietly profited from Reginald's schemes over the years. Harold Whitfield had used his portion of the restitution to rebuild his shipping business, purchasing a single modest vessel to begin again, slower and more cautious than before, but finally free of the guilt and fear that had haunted him for years. He wrote to Elena often, cheerful letters filled with small updates about his growing business and his gradual, hard-won return to a life not defined by silence and shame. Priscilla, true to her word, had transformed the scandal surrounding her cancelled wedding into something entirely her own, using her family's considerable influence and her own newfound resolve to establish a modest legal fund dedicated to helping ordinary citizens pursue fraud cases against wealthy, well-connected offenders who might otherwise escape consequence through intimidation or influence. She visited Elena occasionally, the two of them having formed an unlikely, enduring friendship forged entirely through shared hardship rather than any similarity in their upbringing. And Elena, using a portion of the restitution granted to her father's estate, had finally reclaimed the small tailoring shop that had once been the center of her family's entire life, the very building where her father had spent 30 years building a name and a legacy that Reginald had nearly erased entirely. She stood now in the empty shop, sunlight streaming through windows that had been cleaned for the first time in years, dust motes drifting lazily through the golden light, and felt a wave of emotion so powerful it nearly buckled her knees. She could almost hear her father's voice again, humming quietly to himself as he worked, the gentle rhythm of his needle and thread that had defined so many of her childhood memories. "It's smaller than I remembered," she said quietly, running her fingers along the worn wooden counter, where her father had once measured fabric with such careful precision. "Most places from childhood seem smaller when we return to them as adults," Alistair said from beside her, his voice gentle in the quiet stillness of the empty shop. "Perhaps because we have grown larger ourselves, carrying more than we once could." Elena smiled softly, turning to look at him, still faintly amazed, even after 6 months, at how naturally he had become part of her life. This Duke, who had once complained about weak tea at her aunt's small inn, entirely unaware that fate was quietly weaving their futures together long before either of them understood it. Their relationship had grown slowly and carefully in the months following the hearing, neither of them rushing toward anything neither felt fully ready for, both keenly aware of how much upheaval and danger had shaped the earliest days of their connection. They had spent quiet afternoons together, away from courtrooms and investigations, simply talking, learning each other's genuine thoughts and habits, rather than the versions shaped by crisis and urgency. Alistair had visited the shop several times during its restoration, offering quiet support, without ever attempting to take control of decisions that Elena needed to make for herself. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else could, how important it was for her to rebuild this piece of her father's legacy through her own effort, rather than simply having it handed to her through his considerable influence. "I plan to open within the month," Elena said, walking slowly through the shop, imagining where she would place the bolts of fabric, the small fitting area near the back window, where her father used to work with his most valued customers. "I want to honor what my father built here, though I intend to make it my own as well. I've been developing some new techniques, ideas for combining traditional tailoring with the practical needs of working women in this district, women who could never previously afford the kind of quality clothing reserved only for the wealthy." "That sounds like precisely the kind of legacy your father would have been proud of," Alistair said, watching her move through the space with quiet admiration. Elena paused near the back window, the same window where sunlight had once fallen across her father's workbench every afternoon, and felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, though these tears carried none of the sharp grief that had defined so many years of her life. They felt instead like a quiet, gentle release, the final closing of a wound that had finally, truly, begun to heal. She thought back over the long months since that frantic run across the frozen courtyard, the fear that had gripped her the night of the break-in, the desperate uncertainty of standing before the magistrate not knowing whether justice would truly be served. Each of those moments had tested her in ways she never expected, yet each had also revealed a strength she had not known she possessed, a strength her father had quietly planted in her, long before either of them understood how badly it would one day be needed. "Thank you," she said softly, turning back to Alistair. "Not simply for your help these past months, though I am endlessly grateful for that, but for seeing me, that day in the chapel, as someone worth defending, rather than simply an inconvenience to be quietly removed. I saw someone brave enough to speak an uncomfortable truth in a room full of people who would have preferred silence," Alistair said. "That kind of courage deserves defending, regardless of rank or circumstance." They stood together in comfortable silence for a long moment, the shop around them, slowly transforming, from a place haunted by loss, into something new, something built deliberately, from the ashes of tragedy into genuine hope. "I have a question for you," Alistair said finally, his voice carrying a slight, uncharacteristic nervousness that immediately caught Elena's attention. "Yes?" she asked, curious. "I have spent a great deal of time these past months considering what I truly want from my life, beyond duty and title, and the careful expectations that have shaped nearly every decision I have made since inheriting my position," he said. "And I find, again and again, that what I want most is simply more time, with the woman who once told a stranger his tea complaints were tiresome, without any concern for his rank or his feelings." Elena laughed softly, warmth spreading through her chest. "I believe I called your complaints tiresome more than once, if memory serves correctly." "You did," Alistair said, a genuine smile lighting his features. "And I have thought of that conversation more often than I probably should have, over these past 2 years. I do not wish to rush anything. Elena, we have both endured enough upheaval recently to know the value of patience, of building something slowly and honestly rather than hastily. But I wanted you to know clearly, without any ambiguity, that my intentions toward you extend well beyond simple friendship or shared cause." Elena felt her heart swell with an emotion she had not allowed herself to fully name until this exact moment. Though she suspected, somewhere quietly beneath the surface, she had known it for weeks already. "I find," she said softly, "that I want the same thing. Time, patience, and the chance to build something honest together, without grief or danger standing between us any longer." Alistair reached for her hand, and she let him take it, their fingers intertwining naturally, as though they had always belonged together this way. "Then perhaps," he said, "we begin here, in this shop your father built, surrounded by the legacy you have chosen to honor, rather than abandon. A fitting place, I think, to start something new." Elena looked around the small shop once more, sunlight still streaming warmly through the clean windows, and felt, for the first time in 3 long years, that her father's memory finally rested peacefully rather than restlessly, his name cleared, his legacy honored, his daughter finally standing, not in his shadow, but beside a future entirely her own to shape. "Yes," she said, smiling up at Alistair with quiet, certain joy. "I think that would be a very fitting place indeed." The shop opened 3 weeks later, on a bright, clear morning that Elena would remember for the rest of her life. A modest crowd gathered outside, curious neighbors and former customers of her father's, along with Harold Whitfield, who arrived with a small gift of fine fabric from his newly rebuilt shipping trade, and Margaret Holloway, who brought a simple bouquet of wildflowers gathered from her own garden. Priscilla arrived as well, dressed simply, rather than in the fine gowns she once favored, insisting she wished to support Elena's new venture as a friend, rather than as a woman of society making a charitable gesture. "I have found," she told Elena quietly, as they stood together, watching the small crowd gather, "that I much prefer building something honest, however modest, over maintaining something grand, built on lies. This shop, and everything you have built here, reminds me daily why that choice was worth making." Elena cut the ribbon across the newly painted door with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear this time, but from a happiness so full it nearly overwhelmed her. She thought of her father in that moment, imagining him standing somewhere just beyond her sight, watching with quiet pride, as his daughter carried his legacy forward, into a future finally free of shadow and shame. Alistair stood beside her throughout the small ceremony, his presence steady and warm, no longer simply the Duke who had once defended a stranger in a chapel, but a man who had become, gradually and honestly, an inseparable part of the life she was building. He said little that morning, content to watch her shine in a moment entirely her own, though his hand found hers quietly, as the crowd began moving forward to admire the shop's newly arranged shelves and carefully displayed fabrics. "Your father would be proud," he said softly, echoing words she had heard from him once before, though they carried even greater weight now that the shop finally, truly belonged to her once more. "I know," Elena said, smiling through tears she no longer needed to hide. "I can feel it." Outside, the city moved forward with its usual restless energy, entirely unaware of the quiet, powerful moment unfolding within the small tailoring shop on Wexford Lane, where a grieving daughter had once carried nothing but a folded letter and desperate hope, and now stood instead, holding the beginning of an entirely new chapter, built finally, fully, on truth.